A cop who abducted a 16-year-old girl walking home, dumped her body in the woods, and then filed a police report claiming his gun was stolen to cover his tracks. A school resource officer who met a girl when she was in middle school, and by the time she was 17, she was living in his house with their baby before he murdered her. And a South African police sergeant who spent 6 years quietly killing her own family members one by one and collecting the insurance money. 3 cops, 3 completely different cases. All of them used the badge to get close to the people they hurt. Let's get into it.
Oh man, the girl.
All right.
Oh my God, out there.
It all lined up. Even though the distance was kind of far, I really was hoping it wasn't her.
And you said you've never seen her? Did you kill her?
No.
But you are.
A 16-year-old girl texts her mom at 9:40 at night and says, "I'm walking home." It's a Tuesday in July. Norcross, Georgia, just northeast of Atlanta. The walk should take her about 15 minutes. The route is so short and so familiar, she's done it dozens of times. Her mom is making dinner. The dog is at the door. Everything is fine. The family has a phone tracking app called Life 360. You probably know it. Most parents I know have it on their kid's phone. You open the app, you can see a little dot on a map. That's your kid. Susanna's dot is moving the right direction toward home. Walking pace. 3 miles per hour, up the sidewalk. Then the dot starts moving the wrong direction, and the speed changes. 3 miles per hour becomes 10, 10 becomes 30, 30 becomes 40. Susanna isn't on a bike. She doesn't have a car. She's 16 years old and she was walking. There is exactly one thing that can move a person from 3 miles an hour to 40 in less than a minute, and that's the inside of a vehicle. Her mom is watching the dot in real time, watching it go in the wrong direction. The app sends a crash alert. The mom calls Susanna's phone, goes to voicemail, calls again, goes to voicemail. The dot stops in a place neither of them have ever been, and then the dot disappears. It will take 7 months for anyone to find Susanna Morales. 7 months. And when they do find her, about 20 miles away, in a wood line off a Georgia highway, the man who put her there will already be on the news talking to police, helping with the search, because he is the police. I want to tell you this case the right way, because the more I read about it, the more I realize that the worst thing about it isn't what one man did on a Tuesday night in July. The worst thing is everything that happened before that Tuesday. Every warning sign that nobody connected. Every report a young woman filed that nobody took seriously. The badge that sat on his chest and the gun on his hip while a teenager was walking home in the dark. Before I get into it, if you like the way I do these, please subscribe. It's free, it takes a second, and it genuinely helps. Okay, here we go. Let me tell you about Susanna before we talk about the man who took her. Susanna Morales was born June 24th, 2006. By the summer of 2022, she was 16 years old. She lived on Santa Ana Drive in Norcross, Georgia, with her mom, Maria, her sister, Jasmine, and the rest of her family. She was a student at Meadow Creek High School Junior. Her family had immigrated from Central America. Maria worked. Susanna was the kind of kid teachers describe with that careful word, bright. She had curly hair, and she liked to mess with the color. She dyed it green once, red once, blonde for a while. Her younger sister told ABC News later, "When you remember her by her laugh." Her mom told a reporter that Susanna would come into the kitchen and ask for tacos. "Mommy, I want tacos." "Mommy, quiero tacos." That kind of kid. She played piano. She sang. She just started teaching herself guitar and ukulele like a lot of high school kids do, sitting on the bed, watching YouTube tutorials, slowly figuring out chord shapes. Her family said she was the first person at any get-together to sit down at the piano and start playing. She had a boyfriend named Axel Zaragoza. They FaceTimed. Her family called her Susie. She was less than a year out from her quinceañera. If you didn't grow up around it, a quinceañera is the 15th birthday celebration in a lot of Latin American families. Big dress, family gathered, sometimes a church mass, music, dancing. It's a coming-of-age thing. Susie's family had been putting bits aside for hers. The week before she disappeared, she told her mom, "Quiero tacos." I want tacos at my quinceañera. She wanted tacos as the food, whatever else, tacos. That was the level of her decision-making for the future. What kind of food at my 15th birthday party? On the night of July 26, 2022, around 6 o'clock in the evening, Susanna left her family's house. She walked the short distance over to the Sterling Glen apartments to hang out with a friend. Just an evening with a friend, watching things on a phone, talking, eating snacks. The kind of evening that doesn't feel like an event when it's happening to you, because you're 16 and it's summer, and you have nothing to be afraid of. At 9:40 p.m., she texted her mom that she was walking home. About a 15-minute walk. Less if she didn't dawdle. Through normal Norcross streets, a Georgia summer night, lights on in front yards, the air heavy and warm. At 10:07, a community center camera in the neighborhood picked up a girl who matched her description walking down the street alone. That's the last confirmed sighting of Susana Morales alive. And here's where it gets bad, because I want you to picture this with me. The Life 360 app on her mom's phone. The dot. The dot is on the right street. The dot is moving the right direction. The dot is... Wait. The dot just turned, and now it's going the other way. And now it's moving fast. By the time Maria Morales has dialed her daughter's phone twice and gotten nothing, the dot is gone. The next morning, she went to the police. This is the part where, if you've never had a teenager go missing, you might assume the system kicks in. SWAT, helicopters, Amber Alerts blaring out of every phone in 3 counties. That's not what happened. The Gwinnett County Police took the missing persons report. They started looking. But Susanna was 16. She'd been out at a friend's house. To a lot of overworked detectives, the first read on a case like this is, she's a teenager who ran off. She's going to come back when she gets hungry. Don't panic. Give it 48 hours. Maria did not give it 48 hours. Maria knew her kid. Susie was not the kind of teenager who runs. Susie texted her mom when she was walking home. Susie had a boyfriend she'd been on FaceTime with that day. Susie had been making plans for her quinceañera. You don't dye your hair green and tell your mom what kind of taco you want at your quinceañera party, and then vanish into thin air on a Tuesday. But the system didn't move at the speed Maria wanted. The family, her sister Jasmine especially, they pushed. They did flyers. They went on local TV. They started a petition. They went door to door at the apartment complex with photos. They went to the Latino language stations in Atlanta. They asked everybody. Jasmine would say later, we knew she didn't run away. The months went by. July, August, September, October, November, December. I want to mention something the police later made public because I think it speaks to what those 6 months were like. While Maria Morales was making missing posters and posting them in Spanish on Latino language Facebook groups across Atlanta, her phone started getting calls. Strangers. Some of those calls were people who had seen the posters and wanted to help. But other calls, and Gwinnett police would later confirm this in a press release, were what they called ransom hoaxes. People calling the family and pretending to know where Susie was. People asking for money in exchange for information. People playing with a grieving mother for sport. The detectives debunked those one by one. The family got no closer to finding their daughter. They just got a lot of evidence that there are people in the world who will lie to a mother whose teenage girl is missing if they think they can get a couple $100s out of it. The community got angry too, especially the Latino community in Metro Atlanta. There was a protest. A woman named Arely Guerra spoke at one of them. She said, "When a Hispanic person goes to the department to make a report, I don't want them to label us as gang members, label us as people who will be fine, label us as girls who just ran away." That was the read on what had been happening. The family felt like nobody was treating Susanna like a missing person from a normal family. They felt like she was being filed away as just another Hispanic girl who'd probably show back up. I should be fair to the Gwinnett police. They put out a statement in February 2023, right around the time the body was found, defending their work. They said detectives had worked the case continuously. They said they'd canvassed locations, distributed photos to other agencies across the country. They said they had to respond to multiple sightings and multiple hoaxes. They said they'd kept in contact with the family throughout. But the family's experience of that contact and the police's claim of that contact were two very different sentences in two very different living rooms. Here's something I want to flag, because I think it matters. While Susanna's family was making flyers and walking the neighborhood and crying themselves to sleep, the man who would later be charged with her murder was at home. 6 minutes from their front door, walking his dog, going to work, going to Army National Guard drills, picking up his paycheck from the Doraville Police Department, living his life, watching the news. He lived in the same apartment complex Susanna had walked out of that night, Sterling Glen Apartments, off Windscape Village Lane. He worked there too, on the side, as a courtesy officer. That's a job where the apartment complex gives a reduced rent unit to a cop in exchange for the cop just kind of being around and visible to residents. He had a badge. He had a uniform. He had a service weapon and a personal weapon. He had a key to the building. From his apartment unit, he could see the front of the Morales family's house. He could see the porch. He could probably see Maria turning on the porch light at night, leaving it on in case Susie came back. He was 22 years old. His name was Miles Bryant. I'll get to him. And I have a lot to get to, because the story of who Miles Bryant was and how he got to that uniform is the part of this case that should make you mad. But first, because I think you should understand how this case actually broke open, let me tell you what happened in February. February 6th, 2023, about 6 months after Susanna disappeared, a passerby is driving down Georgia Highway 316. That's a long 4-lane road that cuts east out of the Atlanta suburbs through farmland and pine woods toward Athens, Georgia. The driver pulls over. They need to take a phone call. They get out of the car to stretch. They wander a few yards into the wood line, and they see something they shouldn't. They call 911. When the Gwinnett County Police get out there, they find skeletal remains. 6 months in a Georgia summer and Georgia winter in a wooded area doesn't leave much. The medical examiner will eventually use dental records and DNA to identify the remains as Susanna Morales. Investigators also identify her by a small detail that I want to mention: her fingernails. Susie had painted her nails black before she went missing. The polish, even after 6 months, was still recognizable. There's no clothing on her or near her, and about 30 yards away from the body lying in the brush, there's a handgun. A black Glock 19, standard issue for a lot of cops. When the detectives run the serial number on that gun, it pings. It belongs to Miles Bryant. It had been reported stolen the day after Susanna Morales disappeared. Now bear with me, because the next part is the kind of thing that, when you read it the first time, you have to set down your phone and just go, wait, what? The morning of July 27th, 2022, that is, about 10 hours after Susanna stopped texting her mom, Miles Bryant called in to file a report. He's a cop. He knows how reports work. He told his department his Glock 19 had been stolen out of his unlocked car overnight, along with his wallet, his credit cards, his military ID, the whole thing, from inside an unlocked truck, parked at the same apartment complex where Susanna Morales had been walking around the night before. Why would you report your own gun stolen? You'd do it for one reason. You'd do it because you used that gun or had that gun on you, and you needed paperwork in the system that said, actually, that gun hasn't been in my possession since last night. Somebody else has it. So if you find it somewhere bad, that's not on me. It's the kind of move only a cop would think of, because a cop knows what investigators look at. A cop knows the chain. When the detectives realize the gun is his, they pull his cell phone records. Both phones, his personal and his work phone. And the records put Miles Bryant in two specific places that night. Place 1, the parking lot at Sterling Glen Apartments, at the exact time Susanna Morales was leaving the building. Place 2, the wooded area off Highway 316, the same wooded area where she would be found 6 months later. He was there, that night, and then he was back the next morning. So, I want you to hold that in your head for a second. He had been there in the dark, and then he came back in daylight. And then a few hours after that, he sat down at a desk and filed a paper report about a gun that he claimed to have lost. There's an even smaller detail that didn't get a lot of attention, but that I want to mention because it's the kind of thing that makes a detective sit up straight. When investigators went back through the original police report Bryant filed for the supposedly stolen gun, the date of his report was July 27th. That morning, hours after Susie disappeared. But Bryant's own department's logs showed he'd been on duty, doing courtesy officer rounds at Sterling Glen during the time he claimed someone had broken into his truck. Meaning, if you take his own statements at face value, somebody walked into a parking lot where a uniformed police officer was actively patrolling and broke into that exact officer's truck, took only his gun and his wallet, took nothing else, left no fingerprints, and walked away undetected by the cop on shift. You'd have to believe in a very particular kind of luck to believe that story. There's more. The detectives pulled his internet search history. In the days and weeks after Susanna went missing, the searches included a query that, I'm going to read it to you the way it was read in court. How long does it take a body to decompose? He also searched for the wooded area itself. And later, when the Susanna Morales case was on the local news, he searched for that too. The way you search for a story to see if it's mentioning you. This is not the search history of a man who lost a gun. On February 13th, 2023, 7 days after Susanna's remains were found, Miles Bryant was arrested. The first charge was relatively small, concealing the death of another and falsely reporting a crime. By the end of that month, the Gwinnett County Police Chief, J.D. McClure, was at a press conference saying the charges were getting upgraded. Malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping. The chief used a phrase I want you to remember. He said, "What we do know is, she died at the hands of Miles Bryant." The Doraville Police Department fired him the day of his arrest. Statement out within hours. He is no longer a Doraville officer. The Georgia National Guard, where Bryant had been serving on the side, began their own discharge process within a week. His bond hearings. The judge denied him bond once, then again. He sat in jail. The Gwinnett County Police Chief held a town hall meeting at the end of February 2023. It was packed. The Morales family was there. So were hundreds of other residents from the Norcross area. People wanted to know why this had taken 6 months. People wanted to know why nobody had looked harder at the apartment complex where Susie was last seen. People wanted to know how a man with the kind of background Miles Bryant had was wearing a uniform at all. The chief, McClure, took the questions. He defended his department's work. He acknowledged the previous incidents on Bryant's record, the 2018 stuff, the December 2022 stalking complaint, and he conceded that in retrospect those should have been a louder warning. The family asked for a fair and transparent investigation into Doraville's hiring practices. The family asked for the Gwinnett police to acknowledge that they hadn't followed Georgia state code on how to handle missing juveniles. Some of that went somewhere, some of it didn't, but for the first time in 7 months, the family wasn't standing alone in a room asking those questions. They were standing with a few hundred neighbors asking them too. Okay, now let me back up. Because if you're going to understand this story, you have to understand who Miles Bryant was before that night, and what other people had been trying to say about him for years. Miles Bryant was born in 2000. He grew up in the Atlanta area. He went to Berkmar High School, the same high school Susanna Morales would later attend, though they wouldn't have overlapped. He graduated in 2018 or thereabouts. By the time he was 17, the first incidents were already happening. In 2018, while he was a senior at Berkmar, there was an incident with a 16-year-old female classmate of his. She lived on his street. He allegedly broke into her home. When he left, the girl noticed that multiple pairs of her underwear were missing. The family pulled the surveillance footage. They recognized him. He was their neighbor. They knew his parents. This is the part I cannot stop thinking about. Instead of filing a police report, the family talked to Bryant's parents. The parents, according to court documents released later, talked the victim's family out of filing. Said, "Look, our son's a kid. Let's not destroy his future over this. Let's just handle it between the families." So they didn't file. Years later, when Susanna Morales' case was on the news and the girl realized who Miles Bryant had become, she went looking for that surveillance footage. By then, she said, the family no longer had access to the original footage. They tried to help police reconstruct it. There was a second incident also in early 2018, a different Berkmar classmate. He allegedly tried to break into her home too. When he was caught, he claimed, and this is the line that, when I read it, just sat me down. He claimed he was trying to come over to review homework with the girl. Just review homework. At her house. Through what was not the front door. That family also chose not to press charges. They asked instead that Bryant be trespassed from their property, meaning the family put it in writing. This person is not allowed back on our land. If he shows up, call us. There was a third one. Different girl. 2019. Snellville, Georgia. Bryant, then 18, allegedly broke into her home, walked around, tampered with a lock on a window. Didn't steal anything that the family could tell. The family had security footage but didn't recognize who they were looking at. They didn't go to the police because they had no name. When Bryant was arrested in 2023, that third family recognized his face from the news. 3 incidents, 3 teenage girls, all before he was 19. None of them reported to police in a way that ended up on his permanent record. In between those incidents, Miles Bryant did the thing nobody wants to remember he did. He grew up. He filled out an application for the Forsyth County Jail to work as a deputy. He got hired. He worked there. He moved on to security gigs. He applied to the Georgia Army National Guard. He got in. He applied to the Doraville Police Department. He got hired. Sterling Glen Apartments, the place where Susanna would later be visiting her friend, gave him a courtesy officer gig. Reduced rent, you walk around with a uniform on, you check on residents, you keep the parking lot safe. To his neighbors at Sterling Glen, he was just the cop in unit whatever. Polite, quiet, friendly enough. He'd say hi. He'd walk through the courtyard. He carried a gun on his hip when he was on duty and another one in his car when he wasn't. In the months before Susanna disappeared, 2 more women had reasons to be afraid of Miles Bryant. One was an old friend named Elias Bates. She'd known him since 5th grade. They'd reconnected as adults. They hung out one night in March 2022. According to what Bates told Atlanta News First, later, the day after they hung out, Miles called her and asked if she was home. She said no, she was at work. She was managing a Taco Bell. When she got home from her shift around midnight, her front door was kicked in. A neighbor told her later that they'd seen a man at her door, trying to get in. Her old friend, Miles. Bates went to the police. She filed reports. She told them she thought she was being stalked. According to her, the case didn't move. She also told that to the Doraville Police Department because Bryant was working there. According to her, nobody acted. The second woman, in December 2022, that's a few months after Susanna disappeared, but before Miles was arrested, also reported that he'd shown up uninvited at her home and may have tried to enter. She told local news he was stalking her. The Gwinnett County Police Chief acknowledged this incident in his press conference and said warrants might be coming, but nothing was charged in time to keep Miles Bryant off the street. There's a third piece. Susanna Morales had a friend named Alyssa Marvin. The 2 of them were teenage girls. Sometime in the months before July 26th, they were hanging out at Sterling Glen, and Miles Bryant, a uniformed police officer in his 20s, approached them. He offered them a ride. He offered them edibles. Marvin would later testify in court. I'll read you the exact line. He wanted to drink with me before he knew my age, but he still offered the edibles. They told him no. They said, "We're underage and you're grown." They walked away. Susanna's best friend, a girl named Esmeralda Castillo, said Miles had approached the 2 of them too, offered a ride. They'd said no. So we have, by the summer of 2022, at least 5 or 6 different girls or women who had a personal reason to think Miles Bryant was off. And probably more, since we're only counting the ones who eventually went to the press or to a courtroom. There were almost certainly more. And honestly, when I read about the edibles thing and the underage thing, I had to put down my coffee. Because that's the moment in this story where, if you live in any city in America, you go, yeah, I know exactly what that is. That's the man who hangs around the corner of the neighborhood with a polite smile, and you tell your kid, just don't talk to that guy. Just walk past him. Susanna Morales' family wasn't told. Nobody knocked on their door and said, "Hey, the courtesy officer at the apartment complex your daughter's friend lives in has a thing about teenage girls. Maybe don't let her walk home alone after dark." Nobody had told the family because nobody had a record on it. Because the system, at every step, didn't take any of these women seriously enough to put it in writing. And then it was July 26th. I'm going to walk you through what the investigators eventually pieced together. Not blow by blow. I don't think anybody needs that. but the broad strokes, because they matter. That night, Susanna left her friend's apartment around 10 p.m. She had texted her mom 20 minutes earlier. She walked out the entrance of Sterling Glen Apartments. Cell phone data and a community center camera put her on the right street, walking the right direction, alone. The community center camera footage is interesting on its own. The Norcross Community Center is a small public building near the apartment complex, the kind of place that has a parking lot and a sign and a single camera mounted under the eaves. The angle catches the sidewalk in front. On the night of July 26th, between 10:07 and 10:21 p.m., a girl matching Susie's description walks past the camera, alone, phone in her hand, looking down at the screen, walking at a normal pace. There's nobody in the frame with her, nobody following her on foot, nobody approaching her, just a girl on a sidewalk at the end of a Tuesday. That's the last living image of her. At some point in the next few minutes, she encounters someone with a vehicle. The Life 360 app data shows her moving from a walking pace to about 40 miles per hour in the wrong direction. The exact circumstances, how she ended up in the car, whether she got in voluntarily because she trusted a man in a uniform, whether she was forced, investigators were never going to know that with full certainty. Susanna wasn't alive to tell them. There were no cameras inside the parking lot at the right angle. There was no living witness. There is one piece of context that the prosecutor talked about in his closing, and I think it's worth knowing. Susie had been raised, as a lot of teenage girls are, with the standard set of safety instructions. Don't talk to strangers. Don't get in cars with people you don't know. But also, and this is the important part, if you're ever in trouble or scared, find a cop. Find somebody in a uniform. That's the person who can help you. Brandon Ndlovu, the prosecutor, didn't get specific about what happened on that sidewalk. He didn't need to, but he laid out for the jury the basic theory. A girl walking home in the dark on a stretch of sidewalk that didn't have great lighting. A man in a uniform in a vehicle pulling alongside her. The most likely version of the next 30 seconds is not the one where she's tackled and dragged. The most likely version is the one where a girl who'd been told her whole life to trust the police saw a police officer and didn't run. What investigators do know, and what they argued at trial, is this. Cell phone data placed Miles Bryant in that parking lot at the right minute. The same cell phone data placed his phone on Georgia 316 about 20 miles away later that night in the area where Susanna would be found. The phone went back to the same area the next morning. Then he reported the gun stolen. The chief of Gwinnett County Police, McClure, said in his press conference, and the exact words matter here because he was careful, he said, "We don't definitively know how she died. There's no indication she was shot." He said the cause of death couldn't be confirmed because so much time had passed before her remains were found. But, McClure said, what we do know is she died at the hands of Miles Bryant. I don't want to dwell on what happened in those woods. I think the family has lived with the not knowing more than enough already. What I will tell you is what the indictment ended up alleging. The initial charges were concealing a death and false report. In March 2023, a grand jury indicted Bryant on the heavier set: malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping, and false reporting. In January 2024, the grand jury re-indicted, adding one more count: criminal attempt to commit rape. That's a lot to read. So here's what it boiled down to. In the eyes of the prosecution, Miles Bryant abducted Susanna Morales near the Sterling Glen Apartments. He drove her about 20 miles. Something happened in those woods. He left her body there. And then he tried, using the only set of tricks he knew, the set of tricks a cop has, the paperwork and the alibi, to cover his tracks. His lawyer told him to take a plea deal. The prosecution offered him one before trial. The exact terms weren't made public, but it was the kind of deal where you trade testimony or a guilty plea for the possibility of seeing daylight again someday. He said no. He wanted to go to trial. Jury selection started in June 2024 at the Gwinnett County Superior Court in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Judge Tamala Adkins presiding. The lead prosecutor was a man named Brandon Ndlovu. I want to tell you about a moment from that trial because it's the moment that hit me hardest. The witness on the stand was Gwinnett County Police Lieutenant Xavier Biggers. He'd been one of the lead investigators in the months after Susanna's disappearance. He was talking about searching for her, about what those months had been like, about showing up at the Morales house and not having an update for her family. And in the middle of his testimony, This is a veteran investigator, a man who's seen things. He started crying. He told the jury that he'd become invested in finding Susanna because she reminded him of his own daughter. You can find that clip. He's not performing. He's a guy who came home from work for 6 months and looked at his own kid across the kitchen table and thought, somewhere out there, somebody's daughter isn't coming home tonight. That's who was looking for her. The trial went a week. The prosecution put up Maria Morales, Susanna's mom, first. She testified to that last text. They put up Alyssa Marvin, who told the jury about the edibles and the offer of a ride. They put up Detective Angela Carter, who walked the jury through Bryant's cell phone data. Every ping, every search, every late-night query about how long bodies take to decompose. They walked the jury through the gun, the serial number, the location it was found in, the false report. Detective Carter spent a lot of time on Life 360. She walked the jurors through what they were looking at, frame by frame. Susie's dot, Susie's walking pace. The moment the pace changes, the moment the dot starts moving north, then turns east. The moment the speed reads 40 miles per hour on a residential street where nobody drives 40 miles per hour. The moment the crash alert fires. The moment the dot stops in Dakula, 20 miles from Sterling Glen Apartments. The moment the dot disappears entirely, meaning the phone was either out of battery or more likely turned off. Carter testified to one more thing about that data that I think is worth knowing. The Life 360 ping at the end, before the phone went dark, was right on Highway 316, right in the area where the body was eventually found. The phone and Susie were in the same place at the same time, and then both went silent. The prosecution also brought in cell tower data from Bryant's phones to overlay against Susie's. The maps the jury looked at showed 2 phones, one belonging to a 16-year-old girl and one belonging to a 22-year-old cop, moving in tandem from Sterling Glen out to Dakula. Then Bryant's phone went back toward Sterling Glen, alone. Then it came back to Dakula the next morning, also alone. I want to mention something about jury work that I don't think gets enough credit. These 12 people sat in that room for a week and looked at maps and graphs and timelines. They had to keep all of it in their heads. They had to remember which cell tower meant what, which timestamp lined up with which other timestamp, which gun went with which serial number. Most of us, sitting on a couch watching a movie about a court case, would lose the thread inside an hour. These 12 held it for a week, and when they went back into the room to deliberate, they didn't take long. They played about 3 hours of Bryant's police interview. The footage is public now. Bryant comes off as, and I'm going to be careful with my words here, he comes off as someone trying very hard to seem normal. What's going on, bro? He says it to the detective who's interviewing him. He's a cop, talking to other cops. He uses the lingo. He's calm. He asks about traffic. He talks about the neighborhood. He acts like a guy who's been pulled in for, helping out with some paperwork on a case. Except the detective across from him has already seen the cell phone records. The detective knows. He admits, eventually, to being in the area that night. He says he never got out of his vehicle, just driving through. Personal stuff. Nothing to do with the missing girl. Then the detective asks about the gun, about reporting it stolen, about why a sworn officer would leave his service weapon in an unlocked car. Bryant has answers for all of that. They're not great answers. They're the kind of answers you'd give if you'd practiced them. There's a moment in the interview that became evidence. The detective asks Bryant, directly, eye contact, if he had anything to do with Susanna Morales' disappearance. Bryant says no. The detective asks again, framed slightly differently. No. The detective explains they have his phone in a specific area. Bryant, and this is the part. Bryant pivots. Says yeah, he was there. Says he was driving around. Says it had nothing to do with her. The story changes in real time, based on what the detective puts on the table. That's the kind of thing a jury watches. That's the kind of thing 12 people in a room remember when they go back to deliberate. The prosecution also put up an inmate who'd shared a unit with Bryant in jail. The inmate told the jury that Bryant had said to him, and the line is in the public record, quote, "So far they only got me charged with this one." So far, only this one. That's a guy who already has a list in his head. So far they only got me charged with this one means there's a this one and there's the other ones. It's the line of a person who is, in his own quiet moments, taking inventory. The defense rested without calling a single witness. Bryant elected not to testify. He had the right to. He'd been advised, presumably, that if he took the stand, the prosecution would tear his story to pieces under cross-examination. So he sat there in his suit with his hands folded and let his attorney do the talking for him. His attorney's closing argument was, to her credit, the only argument available to her. She told the jury, "Look, my client filed a false report. He admits that. He shouldn't have done that. He was scared. He found a body in the woods. He made the wrong call. But there's no evidence he killed this girl. There's no DNA on Susanna that matches him. The body had been out there for 6 months. The state can't prove what they say they can prove." The prosecutor, Delphant, in his closing, used a word that became the headline of the case. He said Miles Bryant was a monster. He said for somebody like him, there is no hope. He said the only just outcome was life in prison without parole. The jury went out on June 12, 2024. They came back the same day. Guilty, malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping, false report of a crime, 4 guilty verdicts. On the 5th count, criminal attempt to commit rape, the jury came back not guilty. Not because they didn't believe the prosecution's theory of what had happened in those woods, but because with no DNA, no eyewitness, no surviving victim, the state hadn't met the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt on that specific charge. That's how American jury law works. You can be 100% sure something happened and still vote not guilty on the specific count if the evidence isn't there. But it was enough. The 4 convictions were enough. Judge Adkins moved straight into sentencing. Susanna's younger sister Jasmine took the stand. She was crying. She said, "All I ever wanted was justice for what happened to her." She said her sister deserved to grow up. She said she'd been robbed of a person she loved. Maria, Susie's mom, also spoke. Through a translator. She talked about her daughter, about the night she'd seen the dot moving in the wrong direction, about the months of not knowing, about the morning she got the call that the remains in those woods were Susie. Miles Bryant got the chance to speak. He stood up. He said, "I just want to apologize to everybody, to the victim's family." That was it. Judge Adkins sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 12 months for the false report charge on top. He's 23 years old as he hears that. He'll be in prison for the rest of his life. The Doraville job is gone. The guard is gone. The Sterling Glen courtesy gig is gone. The girlfriend, if there was one, is gone. The apartment is gone. He has a number on a wall in a Georgia Department of Corrections file, and that's the rest of his life. He filed a motion for a new trial. It was denied in early 2026. He filed notice of appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. As of the time I'm putting this together, that appeal is still pending. Appeals in Georgia of this kind, with the evidence this strong, very rarely succeed. But the case is technically still in motion. He's not going anywhere. If you're wondering what life without parole actually means for somebody in Bryant's specific situation, it means he goes to a Georgia state facility where they have to put him on some kind of protective custody because the prison population in any state in this country does not love a former cop, and they really don't love a former cop who killed a teenage girl. He'll spend the rest of his life in some version of a small box, limited contact with other inmates, limited yard time. The Department of Corrections doesn't make those housing decisions public, but the pattern in cases like this is consistent. He's not going to walk a general population block. He's going to spend a long, slow 40 or 50 years inside a wing that exists specifically to keep him alive while he serves his time. That's the punishment. People sometimes argue that's not enough. People sometimes argue that's a kind of mercy. I'll let you sit with what you think. Now, I want to do something I don't usually do at the end of one of these. I want to actually answer the question I keep asking when I read these stories, because there's a question this case raises that won't leave me alone. Why was Miles Bryant ever a police officer at all? Think about what was sitting on the table before he was hired. The 2018 incident with his neighbor, the missing underwear, the window. That should have been a police report. His own parents made sure it wasn't. The second 2018 incident at a different classmate's house. The homework excuse. That family asked for him to be trespassed but didn't press charges. The 2019 incident in Snellville. The Bates incident in March 2022. The kicked-in door. The December 2022 stalking allegation. None of those things kept him out of a cruiser. None of them kept him out of a National Guard uniform. None of them got a single supervisor to sit him down and say, "Miles, why do women keep saying these things about you?" And look, I don't want to make it sound simple. Hiring cops is hard. Background checks are imperfect. The 2018 incident on paper doesn't exist because the report was killed. The Bates incident, on paper, was a kicked-in door with no charges filed. The December 2022 thing was an ongoing investigation. From a hiring board's perspective, they had a clean-cut 21-year-old with a National Guard record and no convictions who said yes sir and no sir at his interview. But women had been trying to tell people, and the system didn't have a place to put those reports, because what each of them was reporting on its own looked small. A funny phone call, a door that got kicked in, an offer of an edible to a 15-year-old at an apartment complex. Each one of those by itself was a thing a desk sergeant could file and move on from. Together they were a person. Together they were a portrait. Together they should have been a stop sign. There's a wider thing going on in this case that I've been thinking about too. The 2018 underwear incident is, for me, the place this all started. Not because it was the worst thing he did. Obviously it wasn't. But because that's the moment when the system that's supposed to protect girls met the system that's supposed to protect young men with futures. And in that meeting, the young man's future won. The girl's safety, and arguably the safety of every other girl he'd encounter for the next 5 years, lost. His parents intervened. They negotiated the report away. They saved their son's college applications and his National Guard application and his eventual police application. They saved his future. The girl who lost underwear didn't have parents who could negotiate the police record off her file. Because she didn't have a police record. Because she was the victim. Her name wasn't going to be on anything. Maria Morales didn't know any of that 4 years later, when she gave her daughter permission to walk to a friend's apartment one Tuesday in July. Maria didn't know there was a polite young man in uniform 6 minutes from her house who, by then, had a pattern. Maria didn't know because the pattern didn't exist in any computer system. It existed only in the memories of 5 or 6 women, none of whom had been in the same room together, none of whom knew what the others knew. I don't know what to do with that, honestly. I'm not a hiring expert. I'm not a chief of police. What I do know is that Susana Morales is dead, and she didn't have to be. And the reasons she didn't have to be are not mysterious. They're written down. Or, more accurately, they're written down, except where somebody made sure they weren't. Maria Morales has been on TV a few times since the verdict. She's small. She's quiet. She has the kind of face you only get from a year of not sleeping. She told ABC News the night Susie went out, she was just a sister, a daughter, a friend. That night she was on the way home, and nobody had the right to take that away from her. Maria didn't say anything about Miles Bryant. She talked about Susie. Her sister Jasmine started a petition after Susana's body was found. The petition asked for 2 things. 1, that local police departments treat missing teenage girls with the same urgency they'd treat anybody else. The 48-hour wait kills cases. 2, that police departments review their hiring. Look at what's in the file. Look at what isn't in the file. Look at what the women who knew the applicant have been trying to say. That petition has thousands of signatures on it. I don't know if it changed any actual department policy. I hope it did somewhere. I doubt it did everywhere. I started this story with a Life 360 dot moving in the wrong direction. I want to end it with one more image. There's a courtroom moment from the sentencing that the press kind of glossed over. Bryant said his apology. He sat down. The judge read the sentence. Life. No parole. The court officers came forward to take Bryant back to the holding area. Susana's family was in the gallery, and as the officers walked Bryant out, Susana's family was holding photographs of her. Just printed photos, held up against their chests. Pictures of Susie when she was 13. Susie singing, Susie with her sister, Susie with her mom in the kitchen. She was 16 when she walked out of her friend's apartment on a Tuesday night. She had told her mom she was on her way. She had a quinceañera to plan. She wanted tacos. A few minutes into a 15-minute walk, somebody pulled up next to her in a car. We don't know what was said. We don't know what kind of voice was used. We do know one detail. The man behind the wheel had a uniform. We teach kids that when something is wrong, you find a cop. You go to the man in the uniform. You trust the man with the badge. That's the whole social contract. This case is the case where that contract broke. And the breakage didn't start on July 26, 2022. It started years before, when somebody first decided that a teenage boy's future was more important than a teenage girl's safety. It just took the bill 4 more years to come due. If you remember anything about Susie after this, not the man, not the trial, not the sentencing number, remember that she texted her mom. That was the last thing she did as a free person. She let her mom know where she was. She was thinking about home. I want to put 2 more details in this video before I let you go, because I think they're details that, if I don't tell you, you won't find on your own. The first is about Susie's school. At Meadow Creek High School Junior, after the body was identified, students set up a memorial. Flowers, signs, a few of the things Susie had loved. Her friends recorded videos of themselves talking about her. They organized small concerts. One of them got Susie's old piano out for a memorial assembly and played one of the songs Susie had taught herself. There were a lot of kids in that assembly who didn't know Susie personally, who'd just walked past her in the hallway. They cried anyway, because it could have been any of them, walking home from a friend's apartment on a summer night. The second detail is about the man Susie was dating, Axel Zaragoza. They'd been on FaceTime the night she went missing earlier in the evening before she walked over to her friends. Axel sat with the family through the months of searching. He went to the memorial. He went to the trial. He was a kid himself, 16, 17 years old. He has to grow up now with this in his head. The last conversation, the things he said, the things he didn't say. None of it was his fault. The thing about grief like that is the brain finds something to be guilty about anyway. The case became national news in May of 2026, when ABC's 2020 ran an hour-long episode about it called Tracking Susanna. John Quinones did the interview with Maria. They walked through the Life 360 data on camera. They showed the dot moving in the wrong direction. They showed the gun. They put faces on this story for an audience that had only read headlines. I don't know if any of that brings her back. It doesn't. I don't know if it changes a hiring practice or a police protocol somewhere. Maybe, I hope. What I do know is that the family that buried Susana Morales is the same family that still puts photos of her up around the house, still cooks her favorite tacos, still has a younger sister who can't say her name without crying. The clock didn't restart on July 26, 2022. It just stopped for them. Miles Bryant is currently housed in a Georgia Department of Corrections facility. He'll be there until he dies. His Georgia Supreme Court appeal is pending. The 2018 underwear case, the original incident that nobody made a report on, is something his old high school classmate now lives with too. So does the second classmate, so does the third. So do the women in 2022 he stalked. There's a whole quiet roll call of people who tried to tell somebody, in their own way, that he was wrong. Miles Bryant abducted a stranger. Our next cop spent years building relationships with the people he would eventually destroy. He met her when she was a child. He was her school resource officer, and by the time everything fell apart, his ex-wife had a restraining order against him, he was facing rape charges, and he still had a badge. The way this unraveled in a single afternoon is genuinely hard to believe.
Oh, they have the babies! Like we have.
They pull out behind him, and a pursuit begins.
Fire! He's fired! He's fired!
She had a court hearing scheduled on the morning she died. Not her. Him. Elias Huizar, former police officer facing multiple felony charges, was supposed to appear in court on April 22, 2024. That hearing got quietly pulled from the calendar. Nobody's explained exactly why. What we know is what he did instead. He put on black clothes, black hat, drove to an elementary school in broad daylight, walked into the bus loading area at 3:30 in the afternoon, in front of hundreds of kids, parents waving from the sidewalk, buses idling at the curb, and opened fire on the mother of his children while their 9-year-old son stood right there on the pavement. 8 shots. Then he got back in his car and drove away. That's the end of this story. But the part that's going to stay with you, that's everything that came before it. 4 years of paperwork, 5 court filings. A woman who was right about every single thing she said and couldn't get a judge to believe her until 69 days before she died. And here's the thing that I can't stop thinking about, even weeks after going through every document in this case. She did everything right. Every single thing a woman in her position is supposed to do. She did it. Paperwork, filings, hearings, testimony, moving counties, documenting everything. She went back to court 5 separate times, and the system looked her in the face 5 times and basically said, "Relax, you're probably exaggerating." She wasn't. I've been through the court filings, the police reports, the local coverage from the Yakima Herald-Republic and the Tri-City Herald, the charging documents, the protection order petitions. There's a lot of coverage out there that treats this like a shooting story. It's not. It's a story about what happened before the shooting, and how far back you have to go to actually understand it. Before we get into it, if you watch true crime here, hit subscribe. Takes 2 seconds, completely free, and it's the only reason I can keep making these. Okay, let's go. Her name was Amber Marie Rodriguez, 31 years old, born and raised in the Tri-Cities area of Washington State. That's Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco. 3 cities in the south-central part of the state that sort of blur together at the edges, built around agriculture and the Hanford nuclear site, and the school districts that serve the people who work at both. Her dad was a retired nuclear plant security officer. Big family, close family. She had 2 boys, and by every account from everyone who knew her, they were the center of everything she did. She worked as a paraeducator at William Wiley Elementary in West Richland. If you're not familiar with the title, a paraeducator is a teacher's assistant. Real in-the-trenches classroom work. You help the teacher run the room. You work one-on-one with kids who need extra support. You know which kids didn't eat breakfast, and which ones are going through something at home. The pay isn't great. Somewhere around $35,000 to $40,000 a year in Washington at the time. The hours are real. People who do it because they actually like being around kids. That was Amber. By every account from her co-workers, she was the kind of person who showed up early, stayed late, knew every kid's name, knew which families were struggling. The teacher she assisted said in the aftermath that the school wasn't the same after she was gone, that you don't just replace what someone like that brought to a room. She kept turning to say something to Amber and then having to remember. That detail hits differently than anything formal or official. That's what absence actually feels like. After Amber died, the flowers at the front of the school stayed up for weeks. The memorial kept growing. Kids kept coming back to add things to it. She had met Elias Huizar in the fall of 2009. She was 17. He was 24. Hold that age gap because it's going to come back in a way you are not expecting. They got married, had 2 sons. For most of the 2000s, from the outside, the marriage looked completely normal. Elias had a stable job. He was hired by the Yakima Police Department in 2013, went through the academy, and became a full officer in December 2014. He did well enough that by 2018, he'd gotten one of the more visible positions on the force, School Resource Officer, SRO. That's the uniformed cop assigned to work inside a specific school during the school day. Walk the halls. Be visible. Be the person kids are supposed to go to when something's wrong. Be the trusted adult in a building full of teenagers. A badge and a gun inside a school. The one person whose whole job title is built around the word safe. I want you to hold that image because we're going to come back to it. Behind that front, things inside the marriage were a completely different story. Amber would later tell police and courts that Elias had a short fuse and was controlling, that he had grown up in a violent household and hadn't left that behind. She described a documented mental health history, PTSD, depression, insomnia, alcohol use disorder, and what one court filing called an unspecified personality disorder. She said she was afraid of what he was capable of doing. She wasn't describing a stranger. She was describing someone she had been living with for a decade, someone she had 2 children with, someone who knew her routines, her workplace, her schedule, her kids' school. That's a different kind of fear than being afraid of someone you barely know. The marriage came apart in 2020. The divorce proceedings, according to a Yakima County judge who oversaw it, were among the most contentious he had encountered in his time on the bench. Both Amber and Elias filed motions back and forth for months. And then the judge made a ruling that, in hindsight, became a structural problem Amber would carry for the next 4 years. He concluded on the record that both parties were equally responsible for how bitter the divorce had become. Not one victim and one aggressor. Two difficult people. Equal blame. That framing got embedded in the file. And every time Amber went back to a judge after that and said her ex-husband was dangerous and unstable, the judges who pulled that file saw a paper trail that said, "She's the bitter ex. Look at this divorce. They were both at fault. Maybe she's the unstable one." She filed for a protection order the first time in 2020. 2 Yakima County judges, across 2 separate filings, said no. Her claims about stalking and mental instability didn't clear the legal bar, they said. So she did the thing people tell domestic violence survivors to do. She moved, relocated to the Tri-Cities, got into Benton County jurisdiction, filed again, another no, then again. No. 4 filings, 4 rejections. 4 different hearings where a woman with a documented pattern of fear and 2 children to protect sat across from the judicial system and was told, effectively, that she hadn't made her case. The thing is, she had made her case. The system just kept deciding a former police officer with a clean-looking record was more credible than the woman describing why she was afraid of him. This is a pattern that shows up in domestic violence cases over and over, and the Yakima-Benton County courts are not unique in it. But it has a name. Credibility gap. The institutional authority of a person's job, their community standing, their ability to present well in a formal setting. These things influence how judges evaluate testimony, even when the law says they're supposed to evaluate the facts. Elias Huizar had a badge for most of those years, and even after he didn't have the badge anymore, he had the resume. Now, here's what was happening on his side during those same years. In 2021, the Yakima Police Department opened an internal investigation into him. The specifics of what prompted it have never been fully disclosed to the public. What came out through careful reporting by the Yakima Herald-Republic and the Tri-City Herald in the months after April 2024 is this. The investigation turned up information about a sexual relationship Huizar had had with a teenager before he joined the police department. That teenager was Amber Rodriguez. She had been 17. He had been 24. They had gone on to get married, which in Washington state law doesn't retroactively erase the age issue. And for a sitting law enforcement officer, it absolutely raised serious questions about his judgment and his pattern of behavior with young women. The department investigated. They found enough to take disciplinary action. And then, this is the part that matters, they let him quietly resign. He resigned in February 2022, immediately following the discipline. No criminal referral to a prosecutor. No public record, no entry in any law enforcement database that would flag his background for future employers. He walked away. His record, from the outside, still looked clean. And within months, he applied for a job with the Richland School District as a substitute teacher. Let me just let that land for a second. A man who had just been quietly pushed out of a police department over an investigation that involved a teenager applied to go work in classrooms and got hired. He was also brought on as a volunteer wrestling coach at Richland High School. How did any of this happen? Because the gap in the system is exactly where he fit. The Richland School District ran a background check. What they saw was a clean criminal record and a former law enforcement officer with prior experience as a school resource officer. On paper, that's not a red flag. That's practically a recommendation. The internal Yakima PD disciplinary file was sealed from public view. It wasn't in any database a school HR department could access. They had no way to know. That's the architecture of how this works. Someone gets caught doing something serious, but not quite criminal enough to generate an arrest record. The institution handles it internally, protects itself from the liability of a public disclosure, and the person walks right into the next role. By 2022, he was in classrooms. And while he was doing that, he was maintaining what the court documents carefully call a relationship with a teenage girl he had first encountered when he was the cop assigned to her middle school. Her name was Angelica M. Santos. I want to tell you about Angelica properly because she tends to get flattened into the second victim in most of the coverage, and she deserves more than that. She was 17 years old when she died in April 2024. At some point when she was 13 or 14, Elias Huizar had been the school resource officer walking the hallways of her Yakima middle school. He was the cop she saw every day, The one she'd been taught was safe. The one adults pointed to and said, "If anything happens, go to him." What happened was the opposite of that. And here's something that got almost no attention in the national coverage, but I think is one of the most important details in this entire case. The first warning signs surfaced in March 2019. Students had been sending messages through Snapchat raising concerns about Huizar's conduct with Angelica. A state-level investigation was opened. Think about what that means. In 2019, there were already signals, official signals, and he was still working in schools 3 years later. Whatever that investigation found or didn't find or chose to do with what it found, that has never been made fully public. According to court documents filed in connection with his February 2024 arrest, Huizar fathered a child with Angelica when she was 15 years old. He was 36. Under Washington state law, third-degree rape of a child applies when the victim is at least 14, but under 16, and the perpetrator is at least 48 months older. He was over 20 years older. This was, under Washington law, a felony, a serious one. Their son, Roman, was born when Angelica was approximately 16 years old. By April 2024, Roman was 1 year old. At some point, Angelica had moved into Huizar's house in West Richland. She was 17, living with a 39-year-old former cop with a 1-year-old baby. We don't know all the details of how that living situation looked day to day, or what Angelica knew about everything else Huizar was doing, or what she had tried to do to change her circumstances. What the charging documents from February 2024 tell us is this. On the night of February 3rd, she and a 16-year-old friend were at his house. There had been drinking. At some point during that night, Huizar assaulted her friend. 2 teenage girls, a baby who was 10 months old at the time. They got in a car and drove around West Richland in the dark, looking for police officers because they were too scared to stop moving. He followed them in his own car. Think about that for a second. A former cop, chasing 2 terrified teenagers through residential streets at night while they drove around looking for help. They found help. They reported what happened. Officers responded to the house on South Highlands Boulevard to arrest Huizar. He barricaded himself inside and refused to come out. A SWAT team was called, 3 hours before he surrendered. He was charged with 2 counts. Third-degree rape of a child for what he had done to Angelica when she was 15. That charge existed because of the pregnancy. Because Roman's DNA established that Huizar had fathered a child with a 15-year-old, and second-degree assault on the 16-year-old friend. He was booked. A judge set his bail at $200,000. He posted it. He walked out. A man pulled out of a 3-hour SWAT standoff facing multiple serious felony charges including a child rape charge, released on bail. $200,000 sounds like a lot until you remember that in the American bail system, you typically pay a bondsman 10%. Someone arranged $20,000, and he was back out in the world. He was supposed to have conditions. No contact with the alleged victims. Surrender of firearms. Supervision. Amber Rodriguez found out about all of it. She found out that the man she had been trying to convince 4 judges was dangerous. The man she had described in those filings as unstable and threatening had been arrested for crimes involving a 15-year-old he'd met as the cop in her school. She found out the same court system that had rejected her protection orders 4 times was now releasing him on bail. She filed again. February 6, 2024, 3 days after his arrest, a Benton County judge finally issued a protection order against Elias Huizar. He was ordered to stay away from her, her home, her workplace at William Wiley Elementary, and their 2 sons. He was required to surrender any firearms in his possession. He was to be under supervision. Amber Rodriguez, for the first time in 4 years of trying, had a judge on her side. In her petition, which is in the public record and which I've read carefully, she wrote that she believed her children would be in danger if Huizar were allowed visitation. She used the word danger. She described his mental health history. She described specific behaviors and incidents. This was not a vague allegation from a bitter ex-wife. This was a detailed, specific, documented account from a woman who knew exactly what she was dealing with. 4 courts had looked at earlier versions of those words and said no. The 5th said yes. Now. Let me back up for a second because I've been talking about Amber in terms of the legal fight, and I don't want to lose who she actually was as a person before all of this became a case. She had been working at William Wiley Elementary for years by the time April 2024 came around. The staff there knew her the way you only know someone after you've shared a room with them through hundreds of ordinary days. She knew which kid was going through a rough patch at home. She knew which families were stretched thin. She was the person in the classroom who remembered that a specific kid needed extra time with reading, or that another one hadn't been eating lunch, or that someone was being picked on at recess. That kind of knowledge doesn't show up in a job description. You either have it or you don't. Amber had it. Her co-workers described her as someone who made the school function in ways that were invisible until they were suddenly gone. That she kept turning to say something to Amber and then having to remember. That's not something you say about a colleague you barely knew. That's what you say about someone who was woven into the actual fabric of your day. She had wanted to be in education since she was young, and she was, at 31, in the middle of trying to rebuild a life that her ex-husband had spent years trying to destabilize. The move from Yakima to the Tri-Cities was part of that, getting into a different county's jurisdiction, starting over in a place where she had family support. Working at the elementary school where her own kid went, that was deliberate too. She could keep her son close. She could see him during the day. She knew the staff and they knew her family situation. She was building something. 2 boys, a job she was good at, a protection order finally in place, a parental rights termination motion filed on Friday. 3 days later, 69 days after the protection order was granted, she took the next step. On Friday, April 19, 2024, she filed paperwork in Benton County Superior Court to terminate Elias Huizar's parental rights to their 2 sons entirely. Not just adjust the custody arrangement, end it completely. She was asking the court to legally sever him from their children. I want to talk about this filing specifically because it's gotten less attention than the protection order, and I think it matters a lot to understanding why April 22nd happened when it did. In Washington state, terminating parental rights is not a minor legal step. It's the nuclear option in family court. You're asking a judge to permanently sever a biological parent's legal relationship to their children. Courts don't do it lightly. The legal bar is high. You have to demonstrate, typically, abandonment, abuse, neglect, or a persistent failure to engage in parenting. Amber had been building that case. Through the contentious divorce proceedings, through the protection order filings, through documenting Huizar's behavior, for years. By April 2024, she had what she needed. She had the February arrest. She had the protection order. She had the history. She filed. That's not a small thing. That's a woman who looked at the situation, assessed what was possible, and made the biggest legal move available to her to protect her sons. She didn't file that termination motion on impulse. She filed it because she believed, with good reason, that she finally had the grounds to win. The hearing for that motion was scheduled for the following month. The first time a clerk was going to process that paperwork was Monday morning, April 22nd. I don't know whether Elias Huizar saw that filing before Monday. The court docket in Benton County is publicly accessible online. If Huizar or his attorney were monitoring it, they would have seen the filing appear on Friday. A termination of parental rights motion has to be served. His attorney would have been notified. Whether that notification happened between Friday and Monday morning has not been confirmed in the public record. What I can tell you is this. By the morning of April 22nd, his entire life was collapsing simultaneously. His police career was gone. He was facing serious felony charges that carried real prison time. His ex-wife had a protection order against him. His sons were effectively cut off from him. He had a court hearing scheduled for that very day, quietly removed from the calendar. And on Friday, the woman he'd spent 4 years trying to discredit in court had just filed to erase him from his children's lives permanently. The timing is what it is. She filed on Friday. He killed her on Monday. On that Monday morning, in the house on South Highlands Boulevard, something happened between Elias Huizar and Angelica Santos. We don't know what. Maybe there was an argument. Maybe she said something about leaving. Maybe she had finally decided to take Roman and go. Whatever it was, Angelica Santos died in that house before 9 in the morning. She was 17 years old, the mother of his 1-year-old son. He put Roman in the car, put on black clothes, put on a black hat, picked up the .40 caliber handgun that his protection order said he was not allowed to possess, and drove to William Wiley Elementary School. He had been to that school before. He knew the layout, he knew the timing, 3:30, the buses, the kids streaming out, the para-educators doing their end-of-day jobs in the loading area. In 2021, during a custody transfer at this same school, he had gotten into a confrontation with Amber's father in the parking lot. There was video of the incident, Huizar removing his jacket, squaring up. The school staff knew who he was. They knew what he looked like. They knew that the para-educator named Amber had a dangerous ex-husband. She walked out the front doors at 3:30, 9-year-old next to her. He fired 8 times, 8.40 caliber rounds. Investigators recovered 8 shell casings from the pavement. She was pronounced dead at the scene. He walked back to his car. Roman was in the back seat. He drove south. The school locked down immediately. Parents were called, counselors were paged. The description witnesses gave to responding officers was clear. Black clothing, black hat, silver Toyota. West Richland PD was at the scene within minutes. A search warrant went out on the South Highlands house. That's how they found Angelica. The Amber Alert for Roman went out that evening. 1-year-old boy, silver Toyota Corolla, license plate CBZ 4745. Suspect Elias Huizar heading south, armed, considered a danger. The alert moved through Washington state, extended into Oregon overnight. Tip line calls came in from across the Pacific Northwest. A Portland sighting overnight sent Oregon State Police into the search. Every I-5 unit was watching for the plate. 24 hours after the shooting at Wiley Elementary, an Oregon State Patrol trooper picked up the silver Toyota on I-5 near Eugene. A pursuit started. Huizar ran. At some point, he lost control of the vehicle. He kept going. A few miles south, his car hit a stopped vehicle in slow traffic, spun into the median, and stopped. Oregon State Police Captain Kyle Kennedy described what happened when troopers approached the vehicle. Huizar died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Roman Santos was in the back seat, strapped into his car seat, unharmed, 1-year-old. Troopers carried him out of the car. There is no trial, no verdict, no sentencing. Elias Huizar was never going to sit in a courtroom and hear what he did read back to him by a prosecutor. The women he killed were dead. The teenage girl he assaulted in February was alive, and the case against him for that assault died with him. She will never see him convicted. There is no mechanism in the legal system that produces justice for her specifically, not in any formal sense. She was a teenager who did the right thing, got in a car, drove around looking for police, filed a report, sat through the arrest process. And the man who hurt her is dead, and there is no courtroom where she got to watch a jury come back with a verdict. Whatever peace she makes with that is going to be something she does on her own terms, not through any formal system. Now, I want to talk about the aftermath because I think it matters. The Yakima Police Department, once this case became national news, had to publicly defend its handling of Huizar. Their statements confirmed he had received discipline and resigned in February 2022. They declined to release the full internal investigation file. The Yakima Herald-Republic and Tri-City Herald pressed hard on this and got partial records, but the complete picture of what Yakima PD knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do about it, that file has not been made fully public. That's a problem, because the investigation isn't just about what happened to Huizar's career. It's about what information existed in an official file that could have prevented him from being hired as a substitute teacher and a volunteer wrestling coach at schools in Richland. The public has a legitimate interest in knowing whether the department's internal process was adequate, whether a referral to prosecutors was considered and rejected, and on what basis the decision was made to handle everything internally. And there's a second layer to this that almost never comes up in the coverage. Remember that 2019 Snapchat investigation, students raising concerns about Huizar's conduct with Angelica? That was 3 years before he resigned. Whatever that investigation found, whatever agency handled it, whatever happened to that file, none of that has been made public either. 2 separate investigations at 2 separate points in time, both producing no criminal referral, no public record, no flag in any database. The Richland School District hasn't spoken publicly about having hired him. Washington State has started tightening substitute teacher background check requirements since this case went public. But what those changes actually accomplish depends on whether the information that was missing from Huizar's background check, the sealed Yakima PD file, could ever make it into a searchable database. Right now, I don't know the answer to that. It's not clear that anyone does. The bail piece. The specific situation in February 2024, a man with multiple serious felony charges, who had just come out of a 3-hour SWAT standoff, who had a documented history of stalking and instability according to his ex-wife's court filings, who was subject to a domestic violence protection order that required firearm surrender. That was exactly the kind of situation that supervision conditions are supposed to address. The conditions that were placed on him didn't hold. The firearms he was supposed to have surrendered were either never actually surrendered, or he got access to another weapon. Either way, the supervision that was supposed to be keeping Amber Rodriguez and her kids safe did not function the way it was supposed to function. Let me tell you where things ended up for the people who survived. Amber and Elias's 2 sons are with Amber's family. Her father, the man who had shown up to custody transfers for years because he knew how volatile her ex-husband was. The man who had that confrontation with Huizar in this same school parking lot in 2021 is part of that family. Those boys are going to be raised by people who knew their mother, who can tell them someday exactly what kind of person she was and what she fought for. Roman Santos is with Angelica's family, her side. He won't remember any of this. He'll grow up knowing his mother only through whatever his aunts and uncles and grandparents choose to share with him, and when. That decision, how much to tell him, when to start, what words to use, is one of the heaviest things Angelica's family will ever face. There are no good answers to any of those questions. There's just the family, and the kid, and the truth. The staff at William Wiley Elementary. The kids who were in that parking lot on April 22nd. The 9-year-old who was standing next to his mother when it happened. These are the people who carry Monday, April 22nd, 2024 in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The school has counselors. The community held vigils. The flowers piled up outside the front entrance and stayed there for weeks. But there is no debrief that makes a 9-year-old unsee what he saw. There is no process that closes the loop on that. Now, Angelica Santos. I want to go back to her for a minute because her story has a specific shape that I don't want to lose in the larger narrative. She was 17 years old when she died, which means she had been 15 when Roman was conceived, 16 when he was born, and 17 for most of the year before Huizar killed her. She had been a kid in a Yakima middle school when Huizar was the cop assigned to walk her hallways. The Washington state law around school resource officers is pretty clear about what the role is supposed to be. They're there to maintain safety, build trust with students, be an approachable authority figure. There are explicit guidelines about appropriate conduct with students, about the power dynamic that exists between a uniformed officer and a teenager, about why that dynamic makes any kind of inappropriate relationship categorically wrong. Huizar's conduct with Angelica Santos was not a momentary lapse. He was the cop in her school when she was 13 or 14, and by the time she was 15 there was a pregnancy. That was a crime under Washington state law. The question of when Yakima PD should have known about any of this, and what their investigations actually covered, is one of the things that has never been fully answered publicly. The Yakima Herald-Republic reporting suggests the 2021 investigation was primarily about his relationship with Amber, the one that predated his police career. Whether investigators also looked at his conduct with students during his time as SRO, and what they found, is not part of the public record. But if the 2021 internal investigation had any information about Huizar's conduct with Angelica Santos, and that information didn't result in a criminal referral, then the failure in 2021 is even larger than what's been publicly acknowledged. Angelica Santos had a 1-year-old baby and was living in a house with his father. She was 17, and she and her friend were brave enough, or desperate enough, to get in a car and drive around looking for police to report what had happened to them. That act of not staying silent is what produced the February 2024 arrest, which produced Amber's 5th protection order, which is the only reason Amber had any legal protection at all in the 75 days before April 22nd. Angelica Santos's decision to report what happened to her is, in a real and direct way, connected to the protection order that Amber finally got. And then Huizar killed Angelica before he killed Amber. I've gone back and forth on how to frame that connection. I don't want to make it sound like Angelica did something for Amber's benefit. She was trying to protect herself and her friend. She was a teenager who had been victimized and she reached out for help. But the thread between those two acts is there, and it's worth saying out loud. Let me talk about the manhunt briefly, because the Amber Alert is a big part of how this case got national attention, and I want to be clear about what Roman's situation actually was during those 24 hours. Roman was 1 year old. He had been in Huizar's car from the time Huizar left South Highlands Boulevard that Monday afternoon until the vehicle was stopped near Eugene, Oregon the following day. Roughly 24 hours. A 1-year-old strapped in a car seat, while law enforcement across 2 states was looking for the car he was in. The troopers who carried Roman out of that car, I don't know what that moment felt like for them. The press conference footage shows Captain Kyle Kennedy being precise and factual about the sequence of events. You can see for just a second that he takes a breath before he says how it ended. And then he moves on to the next piece of information because that's what the job requires. Roman was unharmed physically. He was taken to a hospital for evaluation and released to Angelica's family. He's a baby. He won't have memories of any of it. What he will have is the knowledge when he's old enough that his father killed his mother. That's information he'll receive someday from the family members who are raising him, in whatever form and with whatever context they can provide. Angelica Santos's family is going to have to make decisions about that for years. When, how, what words to use. There are no good answers to any of those questions. There's just the family and the kid and the truth waiting for him. Let me talk about what the protection order system is supposed to do and what it actually does in practice, because this is the part of the case I keep coming back to. A protection order is a court document, a piece of paper that says, this person is not allowed to be near you. If they violate it, they can be arrested. That's the enforcement mechanism. The system works, or is supposed to work, because the threat of arrest deters the person from violating the order. Now, think about who Elias Huizar was. A man who had been a police officer for years, who understood exactly how those arrest mechanics worked, who knew what a legal violation looked like and what was technically not one, who had navigated internal investigations before and knew how institutions processed complaints. A man who, when officers came to arrest him in February 2024, barricaded himself inside his house for 3 hours. That is not a man who was deterred by a piece of paper. The protection order said he had to surrender his firearms. He had a .40 caliber handgun on April 22nd. Either the surrender was never completed, or it was completed on paper and he had access to another weapon, or he acquired one in those 75 days. The investigation has not publicly established which. What we know is, the order said no firearms and he had one. This is a real documented flaw in how protection orders work with certain defendants. When the defendant has law enforcement training or weapons access through networks the system can't monitor, or the knowledge to work around the surrender process, the paper doesn't do what it's supposed to do. The order creates a legal violation if the person shows up near the protected party, but it doesn't physically stop them from showing up. Amber Rodriguez knew this. I think she knew it every single day of those 75 days. The protection order was the best thing the system could give her. She knew it wasn't a wall. She showed up to work anyway, because what was she going to do? Stop living her life? Hide indefinitely? She had 2 kids to take care of, and a job to go to, and a parental rights case to build. She showed up. Every day. And she was killed at the one place she was most predictably findable, at her own school, during the middle of the school day, in front of hundreds of witnesses. One of the harder things about this case is the geography. West Richland is not a big city. Yakima and West Richland are about an hour apart. Huizar knew where Amber worked because she worked at the elementary school her own kids attended. A school that, during the custody arrangement, was a relevant location for the parenting schedule. He'd been to that school before. He'd had a confrontation there in 2021. The staff knew who he was. The school had protocols around that knowledge. But a protocol only works if the risk presents itself in a way the protocol accounts for. A man who parks nearby and walks into the bus loading zone during dismissal, there's no protocol that stops that from happening in the seconds before anyone can respond. The sequence happened in under a minute. By the time any response arrived, Amber was already gone. This is the other thing that's hard to look at directly, even if every institutional failure before April 22nd had been corrected. Even if Yakima PD had referred Huizar for criminal prosecution, even if the school district background check had flagged his record, even if 2 of those 4 judges had granted the protection order earlier, even if the February 2024 bail had been handled differently, a determined, trained former cop with a weapon who knows exactly when and where someone will be standing is extraordinarily difficult to stop, The systems exist to reduce the probability, to increase the number of barriers, to catch situations like this one earlier in the escalation. They can work. When they work, they catch the Elias Huizars of the world in 2021 when they're being investigated internally, or in 2022 when they're trying to get back into a school, or in 2020 when a woman files her first protection order and the pattern of behavior is already visible in the paperwork. When they don't work, when every single one of those barriers fails in sequence, you get April 22nd, 2024. There's one more thing I want to walk through, because it's been bothering me the entire time I've been working on this case, and I think you deserve to hear it spelled out. The $200,000 bail number. I've mentioned it, but I want to sit with it, because I think it gets glossed over. When Elias Huizar was arraigned on his charges in February 2024, the judge set bail at $200,000. In the American bail system, a defendant typically doesn't pay the full amount. They pay a bail bondsman 10%, so in this case, $20,000, and the bondsman guarantees the rest. If Huizar or someone in his network came up with $20,000, he was out. I'm not going to speculate about whether that specific number was the right number or the wrong number. I don't know the full picture of what was presented at the arraignment. What I do know is what came after. The conditions of his release included surrendering firearms and having no contact with the alleged victims. He had a handgun on April 22nd. One of those conditions was not met. In Washington state, when a condition of bail is violated, theoretically the defendant can have bail revoked and be taken back into custody. That process requires someone to notice the violation and report it, a prosecutor or victim advocate to flag it to the court, and a judge to act on it. If Huizar never formally surrendered the firearms, if the paperwork said he did but the weapons stayed in his possession, there may have been no mechanism that would have detected the violation until it was too late. That's not unique to this case. Firearm surrender in domestic violence situations is one of the most documented gaps in the protection system across the entire country. Study after study has found that even when defendants are legally required to surrender weapons, the rate of actual compliance is significantly lower than the paperwork suggests. Some people surrender one weapon and keep others. Some hand weapons to family members rather than law enforcement. Some just lie. And verifying compliance requires resources most jurisdictions don't have. The enforcement problem is real, and it's hard. You can't search someone's house every week to verify compliance. There has been ongoing legislative discussion in Washington about strengthening the actual firearm surrender process in domestic violence cases, requiring law enforcement to physically collect weapons rather than accepting a defendant's self-reported surrender, building better tracking systems, creating enforcement mechanisms that go beyond paper. This case became part of that conversation. Whether any specific legislative change would have saved Amber Rodriguez, I can't tell you that. The case for reform is broader than any single case. But the specific failure here, he had a firearm he wasn't supposed to have, is exactly the failure those proposals are designed to address. The protection order on paper and the protection that exists in reality are not always the same thing. The gap between them is where people get killed. She knew that gap was there. She filed the termination of parental rights motion anyway. She kept going to work anyway. She walked out the front door of William Wiley Elementary on a Monday afternoon with her son, because what was she supposed to do? Disappear? What I'm left with, after weeks of going through this case, is not a clean takeaway. There are too many points of failure and too many institutions involved for any single explanation to capture it. Yakima PD in 2021 and 2022, the 2019 investigation that produced no public outcome, the background check system that couldn't see a sealed file, 2 Yakima County judges between 2020 and 2023, the bail decision in February 2024, the firearm surrender process. Any one of those being handled differently might have changed the outcome. All of them failed in sequence. And Amber Rodriguez was right about her ex-husband from the beginning. She described a man who was unstable, controlling, with a documented mental health history and a pattern of behavior she was scared of. She was right. She described him as a danger to their children. She was right. She filed 5 separate times. She moved counties. She documented everything. She showed up to every hearing. She did every single thing the system tells people in her situation to do. And the system, across multiple jurisdictions, across multiple years, across multiple institutions, couldn't stop him. In her February 2024 protection order petition, there's a section where the petitioner is asked to describe, in their own words, why they are afraid. It's a box on a form. She had filled in that box 4 times before. 4 times, a judge had read what she wrote and decided it wasn't enough. This time, she filled it in again. She wrote down the documented mental health history. She wrote down specific incidents. She wrote down that she feared for her children. She used the word danger. And she signed it and dated it and turned it in on February 6, 2024. A Benton County judge read it. This time the judge believed her. 75 days. That's what she got between that moment and the parking lot. She went to work every day in those 75 days. She walked into William Wiley Elementary. She knew the kids' names. She showed up early and stayed late. On Friday, April 19th, she filed to terminate his parental rights. 3 days later, she walked out the front doors with her 9-year-old. The 9-year-old who was with her on that sidewalk is going to grow up. He's going to be 12 and 15 and 25 and 40. At some point, he's going to want to know everything about what happened and why and what she tried to do. The answer to that last question is everything. She tried everything the system made available to her. She filed 5 times. She moved counties. She documented. She showed up to hearings. She got the order. She filed for termination of parental rights. She did not stop. That's who she was. Someone who didn't stop. The flowers at William Wiley Elementary are gone now. The school is running. The kids who were there on April 22nd are a year older than they were. Life moved forward the way it always does, with or without the people who aren't there anymore. Amber Rodriguez deserved to see her parental rights termination motion succeed. She deserved to watch her sons grow up without Elias Huizar in the picture. She deserved to be 32, 35, 45. She deserved to have been believed 4 years earlier. She did everything right. If you're watching this and you're in a situation where you feel like no one's listening, file anyway. Move jurisdictions if you have to. Document everything. Bring someone with you to custody exchanges if that makes it safer. Do the 5th filing. Amber Rodriguez did the 5th filing. In a different world, the 5th filing would have been enough. For whatever it's worth, you're not exaggerating. You know what you know. If something about this case stayed with you, whether it's the 5 filings, or Angelica driving around looking for police in the dark with her baby in the house, or the 9-year-old on the sidewalk, leave it in the comments. I read all of them, and on a case like this, I think that matters. Actually, let me add one thing I haven't addressed yet because it keeps coming up when I talk about this case with people, and I think it deserves a direct answer. The question is, how does someone like Elias Huizar exist for so long inside systems that are specifically designed to catch people like him? Because on paper, the systems were there. The Yakima Police Department has an internal affairs function. Washington State has a process for investigating complaints about school employees. Courts have protection order mechanisms. The bail system has conditions of release. Background checks exist. Every single one of those systems had an opportunity to flag Huizar, and every single one of them failed to do so in any way that actually protected anyone. Part of the answer is what I've already described. The credibility gap, the sealed file, the legal bar for protection orders. But there's another piece that I think gets overlooked, which is the specific way someone with law enforcement background is able to navigate institutional processes. Elias Huizar wasn't just a former cop. He was a cop who had worked inside a school. He understood how schools processed concerns about staff members. He understood how police departments processed internal complaints. He understood how courts evaluated testimony and what kinds of documentation judges found credible. He'd sat on the other side of those processes for years. He knew how they worked from the inside. When Amber filed her first protection order in 2020, he didn't respond by doing something obviously threatening. He responded by engaging the legal system on his own terms, filing his own motions, contesting the framing, presenting himself as a reasonable co-parent dealing with a difficult ex-wife. And it worked. 4 times, it worked. That's not an accident. That's someone using institutional knowledge to stay inside the system's blind spots. The same skills that made him effective as a police officer. Knowing how to present, knowing what documentation matters, knowing what language a judge responds to. Those skills translated directly into his ability to defend himself in family court. I'm not saying this to make him sound impressive. I'm saying it because it explains a structural vulnerability that doesn't get talked about enough. The people most capable of exploiting gaps in domestic violence protection systems are often the people who have worked inside those systems. They know where the seams are. They know how to look like the reasonable party. They know how to make the other person look like the problem. Amber Rodriguez didn't have that advantage. What she had was the truth, and the willingness to keep putting it on paper even when no one was acting on it. That's it. That's what she was working with. And against someone who knew the system as well as Huizar did, the truth on paper, for 4 years, wasn't enough. The fifth filing was only enough because by then, he had done something so obvious and documented that the system couldn't look away from it. A SWAT standoff, DNA evidence, multiple felony charges. It took all of that before a judge believed her. Think about what that means for the next woman in the same position who doesn't have that kind of documented event to point to. Who's trying to explain to a judge that her ex-husband is dangerous based on patterns and behavior and fear? The things that are real but hard to put in a file. The things that Amber had been trying to put in a file for 4 years. And one more thing about Angelica Santos that I don't want to skip past. By the time Angelica and her friend got into that car in February 2024 and started driving around looking for police, Angelica had been living in a situation most people can't fully imagine for somewhere around 2 years. She was 17, the mother of a 1-year-old, living in the house of the man who had been her middle school's cop when she was 13. We don't know the full picture of how she ended up in that living arrangement, what she understood about her options, what she had or hadn't tried to do before that February night. What we know is that she reached out. She and her friend made a decision to keep moving until they found someone to tell because they were too scared to stop. That's an act of courage in a situation designed to make courage feel impossible. And the outcome she got for that courage was the charges against the man who hurt her and her friend died with him. No trial, no verdict. No formal acknowledgement from a court that what happened to her was wrong, at least not in the way a criminal conviction provides. She was killed 4 months after she reported. Her son is with her family. Her name shows up in true crime coverage as the second victim, usually after Amber's name. She was 17 years old. She deserves more than a footnote. Her decision to report is directly connected to every piece of legal protection Amber received in the last 75 days of her life. Without Angelica's report, there is no February 2024 arrest. Without the arrest, there is no fifth protection order petition. Without the petition, there is no judge who finally believed Amber. None of it happens without Angelica Santos getting in that car and not stopping. I don't say that to give her credit she wasn't seeking. I say it because the full picture of what happened in this case includes her, and the full picture matters. Amber Rodriguez was 31 years old. She had been with Elias Huizar since she was 17. He was 24 when he came into her life, a grown adult, pursuing a 17-year-old. She spent her 20s in that marriage, had 2 kids in it, and spent the first years of her 30s trying to legally disentangle herself and her children from him. She didn't get to be 32. What she got was 4 years of telling the truth and being disbelieved, a protection order 69 days before she died, and 75 days between that order and the parking lot. She used those 75 days to go to a job she loved, take care of her kids, and file the biggest legal move available to her to protect her sons. She built the case right up to the end. That's not someone who had given up. That's someone who was still fighting. The flowers at the school are gone now. The buses still load at 3:30. The building is still running. Life moved forward the way it always does. Amber Rodriguez deserved to see her sons grow up. She deserved to be believed 4 years earlier. She deserved to be 32. She did everything right. Huizar's case exploded in one day. 2 murders, an Amber Alert, a high-speed chase. Our last case is the complete opposite. No chaos, no explosion. Just a police sergeant in South Africa who killed 6 people over 6 years, attended their funerals, collected the insurance money, and went back to work. Methodical, patient, and she almost got away with it completely.
Ndlovu was found guilty of murdering her 6 relatives to cash in on their insurance payouts.
You were there when her body was discovered.
To say maybe she's crazy. She's not crazy. She's calculative. She knows what she's doing.
A woman is sitting in the passenger seat of a car somewhere in the northeast of South Africa. It's March of 2018. The car is driving toward a small town called Bushbuckridge in the Mpumalanga province. 2 men are in the front. A third man is sitting next to her in the back. She thinks they're all there to help her with something. She is a police officer. She has been a police officer for years. She's worked at the Tembisa station in Gauteng, just outside Johannesburg, and she's known there as reliable, hardworking, respected by some of the officers, the kind of cop who gets called auntie by her own family because she's seen as the responsible one. Right now, she's leaning forward between the 2 front seats, calm as anything, explaining to the men exactly how she wants her sister and her sister's 5 children to die. She wants them given sleeping pills first, so they don't wake up. Then the house, her sister's small house in Bushbuckridge, set on fire. The youngest of the 5 children is 5 months old. She's done the math on the insurance policies she's already taken out on every one of them, paid the premiums quietly for months, and has the bank account ready for the payout. What she doesn't know is that one of the men in the car isn't a hitman. He's an undercover South African police officer. And the recording device hidden in that car is going to capture every word she says. Her name is Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu. She's about to become one of the most infamous serial killers in South African history. And the wildest part of her case, the part that, when I first read it, made me close the laptop and just sit there for a minute, is not how many people she killed. It's how many of them were her own family, people who trusted her, people who called her auntie, people whose funerals she organized while pocketing the insurance. 6 confirmed murders, 6 relatives and her own boyfriend. Roughly 1.4 million rand in insurance payouts. By one, accounting from her former colleagues at the Tembisa station, 28 separate policies taken out on family members over a span of 6 years. And the thing that stopped her, the thing that finally broke this whole machine she had built, was a 5-month-old baby. Specifically, a hitman she had hired who could not, when the moment actually came, do what she was asking him to do to a 5-month-old baby. Stick around. Hit subscribe if you do true crime, because this story has layers I don't think you're expecting, and I want to walk you through them carefully. This is the case of Rosemary Ndlovu, the South African policewoman who killed her own family for money. Let's go. I want to take you back to the beginning. Because to understand what makes this case so disturbing, you have to understand who Rosemary Ndlovu was before she started killing people. And honestly, on paper, she was the success story of her village. Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu was born around 1978 in Bushbuckridge. If you don't know South Africa, Bushbuckridge is in the Mpumalanga province, in the northeast, near Kruger National Park. It's rural, it's poor. The villages around it are the kind of place where most of the young women, if they are lucky, end up working in someone else's house in one of the big cities, or selling things at a roadside stall, or going home to no electricity at the end of the day. The Ndlovu family was one of the bigger ones in their village. A mother, Maria Mushwana, who was the matriarch. Several sisters, including the eldest Audrey and a younger sister named Joyce, plus various nieces, nephews, and cousins all spread across Mpumalanga and Gauteng. Rosemary grew up in the middle of that web of relatives. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody attended everybody's weddings, funerals, and Sunday lunches. That tight family network is the part of this story you have to keep in your head, because every single person Rosemary later killed or tried to kill was somebody she had grown up sitting across from at a kitchen table. Rosemary went to primary and secondary school there in Mpumalanga. And then, like a lot of ambitious young South Africans in the late 90s, she got on a taxi to Johannesburg, which is about a 6-hour drive south, looking for what people back home call greener pastures. She wanted a real job. She wanted out of village life. She found her way into the South African Police Service, SAPS. That's a big deal. In post-apartheid South Africa, being a police officer is a stable government job with a pension, with medical aid, with a uniform, with the kind of regular paycheck that the village she came from did not have a lot of. She went through her training. She was eventually stationed at the Tembisa police station in the township of Tembisa, which sits on the east rand of Johannesburg. Working class, busy, the kind of station that handles everything from petty theft to murder on any given Tuesday. She rose to the rank of constable and at some point, sergeant. Her colleagues said she was a respected member of the force. The kind of officer you'd want backing you up on a call. After her arrest, the local press did the inevitable round of interviews at Tembisa Station. And the picture that came back was almost worse than if her coworkers had said she was a creep. They said she was warm, friendly, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who would bring food to the night shift. One former colleague, quoted by News 24 after her arrest, said she had been the kind of person you'd never suspect of anything. There was, though, a second version of Rosemary that some of her colleagues knew about. The colleagues who worked the night shift with her, the ones who'd been to her house, they knew about the gambling. According to court testimony years later, Rosemary had a serious gambling habit. She had debts she couldn't get out from under. There were loan sharks in Tembisa she owed money to, the kind of loan sharks that, in South Africa, you really, really do not want to owe money to. Sometimes she would bunk off shifts to avoid running into them. The respected constable with the uniform and the badge was, on her own time, a person who was constantly out of money and constantly trying to figure out how to get more of it. There was, by one specific witness account at her trial, a BMW she was driving by 2017, a car she could not realistically afford on a constable's salary, a car she was on the brink of losing back to a loan shark she had borrowed against it. That detail came out casually during the recording the undercover officer made of her on the way to Bushbuckridge in March 2018. Rosemary herself, on tape, explained to the men in the car that part of why she needed her sister and the 5 children dead, right then, was because she was about to lose her BMW. A constable, about to lose a car. So the solution she landed on was kill 6 people, one of them a baby, to keep the BMW. Read that sentence to yourself one more time, because it's the inside of her head in a single line. For most of us, that scenario ends in a personal loan, a payment plan, maybe a second job on the weekends. For Rosemary Ndlovu, it ended in a way that, when you lay it all out, almost doesn't make sense as a sequence of decisions a human being would actually make. Let me introduce you to the first victim. His name was Witness Madala Homu. He was Rosemary's cousin. He lived in the Olifantsfontein area, which is near Tembisa, in the East Rand. By all accounts, the family was close. He was the kind of cousin who showed up at the funerals, at the weddings, at the family gatherings. He trusted Rosemary. To Witness Homu, she was the one in the family who had made it. The cop, the auntie, the success story. In March of 2012, Witness Homu was found beaten to death. His body was discovered with severe head injuries in Olifantsfontein. The murder, on its face, looked like a random violent attack. A robbery gone wrong, maybe. Violent crime is sadly common in those townships, and the police investigation closed without identifying a suspect. The local cops had 1,000 other open files. One more unsolved Olifantsfontein beating just went into the cabinet. What investigators would not figure out for another 6 years was this. In the months before his death, Rosemary had quietly taken out life and funeral insurance policies on Witness Homu. She had listed herself as the beneficiary. In at least one of those policies, she had told the insurance company that he was her husband. He was not her husband. He was her cousin. The insurance company didn't verify it. They issued the policy. And here's the part of that paperwork move that gets me. Rosemary, by 2012, had been a serving police officer for years. She knew that homicide investigators routinely pull insurance records on murder victims. She knew that husband listed as a beneficiary on a policy for a man who was not actually her husband was, if anyone bothered to check, a screaming red flag. She did it anyway. Either she had calculated correctly that nobody was going to check, or she had stopped caring whether they did. When Witness Homu died, Rosemary collected over 131,000 rand in payouts. For context, in 2012 South Africa, that was real money. Enough to pay off loan sharks. Enough to feel for a few months like the problem was solved. And here's where I had to stop and think for a minute when I was working through this case. Because if you imagine someone who has just murdered a family member for money, you probably imagine guilt. You imagine sleepless nights. You imagine someone who, at minimum, is rattled, spooked by their own reflection, doesn't want to do it again. That's not what happened. Rosemary went back to work the next week, wore the uniform, took the calls, showed up to family functions, and grieved for her cousin in front of the relatives. As far as everyone she knew was concerned, Auntie Rosemary was the same person she had been before March 2012. The grief was real, or it looked real, and nobody questioned a thing. She was learning. She was figuring out in real time exactly how easy it actually was. The next victim was harder, because the next victim lived in her house. Audrey Ndlovu was Rosemary's older sister. By 2013, Audrey had moved in with Rosemary at her rented place in Tembisa. The family understood it as the older sister staying with the younger one because the younger one had the steady income from the police job and the older one needed somewhere to land for a while. They were sisters. They got along. The neighbors saw them together all the time. Audrey had her own kids back home in Mpumalanga, including a son named Bryant Mashigo. Remember that name, he comes back into this story in a brutal way. And Audrey was working through a rough patch, the kind of rough patch where you go stay with your sister for a few months until things settle. Rosemary, the auntie, the cop, was happy to have her. That's the version of the story the family understood. What the family didn't know, what nobody knew, is that in the months leading up to June of 2013, Rosemary had quietly taken out a stack of insurance policies on Audrey. In some of them, she had filled out the paperwork by pretending to be Audrey herself, signing her sister's name, making up answers to the health questions. The insurance industry calls that practice stranger-originated life insurance, and it's specifically illegal. You cannot take out a policy on someone's life without their knowledge and consent. Rosemary did it anyway. She spread the policies across multiple insurance companies, Clientele, One Life, Old Mutual, Asapol, so that no single underwriter would see the total exposure. In June of 2013, Audrey was found dead inside the room she rented at Rosemary's house. The cause of death, per the autopsy, was a combination of poisoning and strangulation. Both, which is the kind of forensic detail that tells you something specific about what happened, that the poisoning on its own was not finishing the job fast enough, and somebody in the room finished it manually. The crime scene had been tampered with before the police arrived. Rosemary, who was the one to discover the body, would later be convicted of defeating the ends of justice for what she had done at the scene before the police arrived. This is the only one of the 6 murders where the prosecution, at trial, said with confidence that the killing was done by Rosemary's own hands. Not by hitmen. By her. With her sister in the room they shared a wall with. That's the level of cold she was capable of by 2013. The insurance payout on Audrey alone was 717,421 rand and 17 cents. 750,000 rand. Rosemary collected on every policy. The cousin had been a test. The sister was a payout. I want to read you what Rosemary said the money was for, in her own words, much later, during sentencing. The judge asked her what she had to show for the 1.4 million rand in insurance she had collected over the years. She said she had paid for Audrey's funeral, erected a tombstone for her sister and their father, renovated their mother's house in Bush Buckridge, and supported Audrey's surviving children. So according to Rosemary herself, the money she got for killing her own sister was, in part, used to put up the tombstone over her own sister's grave. The judge in that sentencing hearing pointed out that, by Rosemary's own accounting of the money, almost none of it could be located. No boyfriend she had spent it on, no property, no assets. The math, the judge noted, didn't add up. Something else had happened to that money. The judge had his guess. Loan sharks, gambling, a debt cycle that 1.4 million rand in murder profits had vanished into. The same month she killed her sister. Same year, same area. Her niece died too. Ndlovu was about 10 years old in 2013. She was Rosemary's niece. She had been staying with Rosemary for a period of time before her death. Rosemary would later tell investigators that the niece was a heavy drinker, an attempt to suggest the girl had died of some kind of alcohol-related cause. Let's pause on that for a second. The deceased was a 10-year-old child. The serving police officer Auntie was, in a recorded statement to fellow officers, trying to pin the death on the alleged drinking habits of a 4th grader. That is not the kind of cover story you tell when you think anyone is going to look closely. That is the kind of cover story you tell when you have already decided nobody important is going to bother asking follow-up questions. The trial heard a different story. Ndlovu was found beaten to death. The insurance payout on Zanele Motha was approximately 119,840 rand. A child. The funeral policy paid out, no questions asked. By the end of 2013, Rosemary had killed 3 family members in 18 months: the cousin, the sister, the niece, 3 insurance windfalls, and in the small ecosystem of her extended family, 3 funerals that everybody attended together, holding hands, comforting each other, never once suspecting that the person at the center of all of it was the one responsible. I want to talk about that for a second, because in a lot of serial killer cases, the killer is a stranger. The victims don't know them. The danger comes from outside the family. But that's not this case. The danger here was the auntie. The danger was the person organizing the funeral, choosing the flowers, hosting the wake at her house, paying for the headstone. The deeper a family's bond, the more catastrophic this kind of betrayal is, and you can see it in the testimony that her surviving relatives later gave at her trial. There was no language for it. They didn't have a word. Now, in 2015, the pattern shifted in a way that, when you look at it later, tells you Rosemary was either escalating or starting to feel untouchable, because the next victim was not a distant relative she could explain away. The next victim was the man she shared a bed with. His name was Yingwani Maurice Mabasa. He was her live-in partner, boyfriend, common-law husband, depending on who in the family you ask. He was the father of one of her children, the man she had been with for several years, the man who knew where she kept her things, the man who came home to her at the end of the day. In October of 2015, Maurice Mabasa was found dead. His body had been dumped in Olifantsfontein, the same general area where 3 years earlier, her cousin Witness Homu had been dumped. The autopsy was, I'm going to give you the number because the number is the whole story, over 80 stab wounds. Some sources say 76, some say more than 80. The exact count doesn't really change the meaning. This was an attack so excessive, so methodical, that it had to have been more than one person inflicting it. Maurice had been killed by hitmen. According to evidence that came out at trial, Rosemary had hired them. The over 80 stab wounds were not the work of a stranger. They were the signature of a contracted kill, the kind of overkill that's meant to look like a personal hatred, like a robbery turned violent, like a relationship gone wrong, like anything except a wife paying men to do this so she could cash in on the policies in his name. She collected on those policies. She organized his funeral. She wore black. She accepted the condolences of her family. And then she went back to work the next day at the Tembisa police station. Look, I have read a lot of true crime files. I have walked through a lot of cases where the killer is someone the victim trusted, where there's a chilling element of intimacy in the act. But the level of compartmentalization required to live with this man, raise a child with him, and then pay people to stab him 80 times, that's a kind of cold that I find genuinely hard to describe. There was no rage there. There was no jealousy. The autopsy didn't suggest a crime of passion. This was inventory management. He had stopped being useful as a living person and started being more useful as a paid policy. And honestly, the thing that bothers me most about this period of Rosemary's life isn't even Maurice. It's that, around this same time, Rosemary's own 2 children also died, under circumstances that have never been publicly explained. The South African press and her own surviving sister Joyce, in a Sunday Times interview years later, have raised the question of whether Rosemary may have killed them too. There have never been charges filed on those deaths. The investigations, according to Joyce, vanished into thin air. We do not, on the record, know what happened to those children, but we know they died young, and we know who their mother was. I want to pull back for a minute, because at this point in her timeline, Rosemary has, that we know of, killed 4 people: cousin, sister, niece, boyfriend. She has collected close to R1 million in insurance payouts. She is still a serving police officer. She is still a respected member of her family. Nobody in her immediate world has any reason to suspect her of anything. How did she keep getting away with it? The honest answer is, she had a few advantages most killers don't have. First, she was a cop. When her family members died, the responding officers were her colleagues, or at least adjacent to her work. The investigations were not aggressive. She knew the system. knew the paperwork, knew exactly what to say and not say to detectives. She had inside knowledge of how a sloppy homicide file actually closes, quietly, with a no suspect identified line and a stack of unsolved files on a desk somewhere. Second, the insurance industry in South Africa at the time had basically no information sharing between companies. Clientele didn't know what One Life had on you. Old Mutual didn't know what Assupol had. So Rosemary could take out a funeral policy on her cousin at one company, a life policy on him at a second company, and a third small policy at a third company, and no single underwriter would ever see the total. By the time she had 3 policies on one person, the system had no idea anyone was even at risk. Third, and this is the one I think gets undersold, she was patient. She did not rush. She waited the required period after taking out a policy before the death occurred, so payouts would not be flagged as suspicious. She paid the premiums on time. She maintained the appearance of a normal family member, and when she struck, she always used distance, somebody else's hands, somebody else's weapon, somebody else's location. The combination is what made her so hard to catch. A cop with insider knowledge, working a fragmented insurance industry, with the patience of someone who treated murder like a long-term investment strategy. 2 more victims before her empire fell apart. And the timing of them is where the story starts to feel different. Because by 2017, Rosemary is not killing every year. She's almost, and I want to be careful with this word, comfortable. The early kills had spread across 2012, 2013, 2015. After that, things slowed. The money from Maurice and Audrey had given her some breathing room, but then she went back to the gambling. The loan sharks came back. She needed another payout. April 2017. Her nephew, Mayeni Mashaba, was found dead in Olifantsfontein. The cause of death was head injuries, consistent with a beating. Witnesses placed Rosemary as having met up with Mayeni the day before he died. By the prosecution's account at trial, she had arranged for him to be in a specific place at a specific time, knowing what was going to happen there. Insurance policies on him, pre-existing, set up by Rosemary, paid out. The family grieved. The auntie organized another funeral. What's almost worse about Mayeni's death than the death itself is the casualness of how Rosemary handled it afterward. Co-workers at the Tembisa station remembered her coming into her shifts the same as always. She talked about her nephew's funeral the way you'd talk about a relative who died of natural causes. Sad, but life goes on. Nobody at the station, in retrospect, remembered her crying over Mayeni. Not once. By this point, if you are paying attention to the geography, you are noticing something. Olifantsfontein, Olifantsfontein, Olifantsfontein. 3 of the bodies, witness Homu in 2012, Maurice Mabasa in 2015, Mayeni Mashaba in 2017, were all found in the same general area. The Tembisa police, in retrospect, should have been able to draw a circle on the map. They didn't. Or they did and nothing came of it. Either way, the pattern was sitting there in plain sight, waiting for somebody to look. Nobody looked, because nobody wanted to look at Constable Ndlovu. The last successful murder was the one that broke the family. His name was Bryant Mashigo. He was Rosemary's nephew, Audrey's son, the son of the sister she had killed in 2013. Bryant had grown up partly with his grandmother, Maria Mushwana, the family matriarch. He had spent years not knowing exactly what had happened to his mother. He was a teenager by the time he started really asking questions. Specifically, Bryant started asking about the money. He had heard somewhere, from another relative, from a whisper at a family gathering, that Auntie Rosemary had collected a serious amount of insurance after his mother's death. He didn't believe it at first. He confronted her. They argued. Bryant told other family members that he thought something was wrong, that Auntie Rosemary's grief had never quite added up to him. On January 22, 2018, Bryant was last seen alive in Rosemary's company in Bushbuckridge. 2 days later, on January 24th, his body was found in a marketplace in Dwarsloop with fatal head injuries. He was killed by hitmen Rosemary had hired. The insurance policies on Bryant, taken out by Rosemary, paid out. She collected. Again. And here is the moment in this whole story where it stops being a chain of killings and starts being a portrait. Because by January of 2018, Rosemary Ndlovu had developed a problem. She had killed 6 people for money. She had received over R1 million in insurance, and she had spent most of it. The gambling and the loan sharks had eaten through the cash. The cycle she was on required, by its own internal logic, more death, more policies, more payouts. So she planned the next one, the biggest one yet. This time, she was going to kill her sister Joyce Ndlovu, also called Nomia in some of the family records, along with all 5 of Joyce's children. Joyce lived in Bushbuckridge with her kids. The youngest of those children was 5 months old. The oldest was a teenager. Rosemary's plan, which she laid out in detail to the men she thought were hitmen, was that the family would be given sleeping pills first so they wouldn't wake up, and then the house would be set on fire with all of them inside. She had taken out insurance policies on every one of them. The man she initially recruited for this job was named Ndlovu Vincent Kunene. He was not a professional hitman in any meaningful sense of the word. Years earlier, Kunene had been arrested by Rosemary on a gun possession charge. They had crossed paths through her work. Later, in December of 2017, they reconnected when Rosemary started spending time with Kunene's sister, a woman named Sebasile, who had become her friend. According to Kunene's own testimony at trial, Rosemary leveraged the old arrest. She had been the cop who had let some things slide back then. Now, she told him, he could return the favor. She wanted his help killing some people in her family. Kunene initially said yes. Hard to say why. Maybe out of intimidation, maybe out of opportunism, maybe because at first he didn't realize how serious she was. Rosemary started laying out targets for him and his friend, Lakiwe Mkize. First, she wanted them to kill her cousin Gladys Nomasanto Ndlovu in Tembisa. When that didn't happen, she pushed for them to go after her mother, Maria Mushwana. That didn't happen either. And then she pushed for the big one. Joyce. The 5 children, the 5-month-old. Kunene, by his own account on the witness stand, hit a wall there. He could deal with the idea of contract killing as a concept. He could not deal with the idea of pouring petrol around a house in which a 5-month-old baby was sleeping and then setting it on fire. According to his own testimony, the baby was what stopped him, not the mother, not the older children, the 5-month-old. He went to the police. This is the moment the case turns. Because for the first time in 6 years, somebody in Rosemary's orbit has decided that what she's asking for is past the line. And the police, when they hear what Kunene is saying, do something the system should have done years earlier. They actually take him seriously. A sting operation was set up. The plan was simple. Kunene would pretend to be going along with the plot. He would bring in another hitman, actually an undercover South African police officer, and they would meet with Rosemary in person in a car on the way to Joyce's house in Bushbuckridge with a recording device hidden inside the vehicle. The detail work behind that sting deserves a second of your attention, because South African policing, at the time, did not have a great reputation for putting this kind of effort into family violence cases. The investigators built a careful trap. They got Kunene to wear a wire. They wired the car. They coordinated jurisdictions, since the murders were going to happen in Mpumalanga, but the planning was happening in Gauteng. They prepared the undercover officer with a backstory of his own, ready to be confirmed if Rosemary asked questions. On March 7th, 2018, that meeting happened. Rosemary, who had checked herself into a hospital a few days earlier and gotten a day pass, supposedly for medical reasons, but the prosecution would later argue to create an alibi for the murders, got into the car with Kunene, his friend Mkize, and the undercover officer. The car drove from Gauteng toward Bushbuckridge, several hours away. On the way, the car stopped. Rosemary, on the recording, instructed the men to buy petrol. She handed over money for it. The petrol, she explained, was for them to use to set Joyce's house on fire after they had drugged the family inside. She talked through the layout of the house. She talked through who would be sleeping where. She named the children, individually by age, and discussed which ones might be hardest to get past if any of them woke up before the fire took hold. The hidden cameras captured all of it. Her voice, her face, her completely composed delivery. The level of detail. Watching the footage later, the courtroom heard a woman who, by every indication, was talking through a household chore. There was no whispering. There was no glancing around. She was a serving police officer giving operational instructions to subordinates. When they got close enough to Joyce's house, the trap closed. Rosemary was arrested at a Bushbuckridge taxi rank on March 7, 2018. Her house in Gauteng was searched. Investigators found the stack of insurance policy documents, the paper trail she had been hiding for 6 years, policies on the cousin, on the sister, on the niece, on the boyfriend, on the nephews, and policies prepared and paid up on Joyce and on her 5 children. According to her former colleagues at Tembisa Station, by the time she was arrested, she had taken out 28 separate insurance policies on family members. 28. Just sit with that number. For most people, taking out a single life insurance policy is a paperwork-heavy ordeal that happens once. Rosemary had quietly done it 28 times on people who shared her blood. Joyce, when she was told what her own sister had been planning, reportedly went into a kind of shock that the family says she has never fully come out of. Maria Mushwana, the matriarch, the mother, the woman who had buried a daughter and grandchildren and a son-in-law and a nephew, was being told now that her own daughter, the police officer she was proud of, had been the cause of all of it, and had been planning to kill her too. The trial took years to actually start. Rosemary was held at the Gosi Mampuru, the second correctional center in Pretoria, South Africa's maximum security prison, while the case wound its way through pre-trial preparation. The main trial finally opened in July of 2021 in the South Gauteng High Court, sitting at the Palm Ridge Magistrates Court near Johannesburg. The judge was Ramarumo Monama. Over the course of about 3 months, the prosecution called more than 50 state witnesses, police officers, insurance investigators, phone records experts, forensic pathologists, the hitmen, Kunene and Mkhize, who had originally turned her in, family members, co-workers from Tembisa, even, at one point, a former school friend from Bushbuckridge. The state laid out, with cell phone records and insurance documents and timeline charts, a picture of 6 years of murder for profit. Some of the most damaging testimony came from the hitmen themselves. Kunene took the stand and described in detail how he had met Rosemary years earlier when she had arrested him on a gun possession charge, how she had reappeared in his life through his sister Sebasile, and how she had pressured him into helping her over the course of late 2017 and early 2018. He walked the court through the trip in the car, the hospital alibi, the petrol stop. Then he pointed at Rosemary across the courtroom and identified her in front of the judge. Mkhize, his friend, gave matching testimony. The two of them, separately, told the same story under cross-examination. The defense tried to suggest they were unreliable witnesses with criminal histories of their own, which they had, but the recording of the sting operation existed independently of their testimony. The video was the video. Rosemary's voice was Rosemary's voice. No amount of attacking the hitman's credibility could erase what the camera had captured. The cell phone evidence was the other piece that buried her. Investigators had pulled Rosemary's call records going back years. They charted the pattern. Every single murder in the indictment was preceded, in the days or hours before, by a burst of calls between Rosemary and the men later identified as the hitmen. The records placed her in the company of nearly every victim shortly before their death. Mayeni Mashaba, the nephew, had been with her the day before he was killed. Bryant Mashego, the last victim, had last been seen alive in her company. The phone records didn't just suggest a connection. They documented her physical proximity to bodies that were about to become bodies. The insurance documents, gathered from the 4 companies named in the fraud counts, Clientele, One Life, Old Mutual, Asupol, completed the picture. The state produced application after application in Rosemary's handwriting or with Rosemary's name as beneficiary, showing the policy network she had built. Some of the applications had false information on them about her relationship to the insured person, the cousin as husband, the relative as spouse, the lies she had told to get past the underwriters. Rosemary pleaded not guilty on every single count except one. She maintained through her entire trial that she was the victim of a frame-up, that the recordings had been edited, that Kunene was lying, that she was being scapegoated by her family, that the insurance policies, 28 of them, were just in case, Something happened to her relatives and she didn't want to be financially burdened by their funerals. The judge, listening to this defense over months, did not buy any of it. There were moments during the trial that became, to put it carefully, infamous in South African media. Rosemary did not behave the way a defendant on trial for 6 murders typically behaves. At one point, in front of court spectators, she lifted her skirt in what observers described as a gesture meant to shock and provoke. She laughed in the middle of victim testimony. She made faces at witnesses. The South African press called the proceedings more than once a circus. Her own family, sitting in the gallery, did not recognize the woman they were looking at. A criminologist, called as an expert witness by the state, walked the court through a behavioral profile of Rosemary based on the evidence. The profile concluded she met the textbook definition of a serial killer, a person who kills multiple victims over time with a cooling-off period in between, for a consistent motive. The criminologist described her as manipulative, lacking empathy, lacking remorse, and operating with the kind of cold cost-benefit analysis that you do not see in someone who is mentally ill in the legal sense. She was not insane. She was, by the experts' reading, simply a person who had decided that other people's lives were worth less to her than her own short-term cash flow. The one person who took the stand in her defense was her own mother, Maria Mushwana, the same woman Rosemary had tried to have killed. Maria testified that she didn't believe her daughter was capable of what she was being accused of. It was one of the more wrenching moments of the trial. A mother defending the daughter who had paid people to murder her. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, would later note specifically that Maria's loyalty was admirable and tragic, and that it changed nothing about the evidence on the table. On October 22, 2021, Judge Manama delivered the verdict, guilty on 6 counts of murder. Witness Madala Homu, Audrey Somisa Ndlovu, Zanele Motha, Morris Mabasa, Mayeni Mashaba, Bryant Mashigo. Guilty on 4 counts of fraud, 1 for each insurance company she had defrauded. Clientele, One Life, Old Mutual, Asupol. Guilty on 1 count of defeating the ends of justice for what she had done to the crime scene where her sister Audrey was killed. Guilty on 7 counts of incitement to commit murder for the various hitmen she had recruited over the years. Guilty on the attempted murder of her own mother. The court found that on the conspiracy count related to the failed plot against her sister Joyce, the state had not quite proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that single count was discharged. Everything else stood. Sentencing came on November 5, 2021, in the same Palm Ridge courtroom. Before the judge spoke, victims' family members were invited to address the court. Charlene Mashego, Bryant's grandmother, stood up and described what it was like to be raising her great-grandson, the son Bryant had left behind, because the boy's mother was not in his life. The boy's father, Bryant, was dead because of Auntie Rosemary. The boy's grandmother, Audrey, was also dead because of Auntie Rosemary. The kid was being raised by his great-grandmother because Rosemary had killed 2 generations of his family for insurance money. When Rosemary was given the chance to speak, she addressed the victims' families. She said she was sorry for the pain they felt. She maintained, even at sentencing, that she had not killed any of them. She said the truth was known only by God. She asked her own family to forgive her. She told her siblings she was still their sister. She cried. Then Judge Manama spoke, and his words, which I went and pulled the transcript on, are the kind of judicial language you don't usually hear come out of a sentencing hearing. He called her cruel, hellish, bullish, and brazen. He called her manipulative and deceitful. The court found she had monetized the lives of her relatives, treating them as a commodity, that she had tricked her victims into believing she loved them. They had all called her auntie, and then she had struck like a vulture. According to Manama, she had shown a complete absence of remorse, and he did not believe she could be rehabilitated. The sentence, when it came down, was the most severe set of punishments a South African court can hand out short of the death penalty, which South Africa abolished in 1995. 6 life sentences, 1 for each murder, to run concurrently, which means they all start counting at the same time, but each one a full life term. On top of that, 5 additional years for defeating the ends of justice. 10 years on each of the 4 fraud counts. 10 more for each of 7 incitement to commit murder convictions, and another 10 for the attempted murder of her mother, plus an additional 25 years tied to the failed plot against Joyce and her children. Across the math, total additional time on top of the life sentences came to somewhere between 95 and 125 years, depending on how the court counted the concurrent and consecutive portions. The practical effect, Judge Ndlovu said in plain language, she will die in prison. She was sent to the Kagosi Mampuru, the Second Correctional Center, the same maximum security facility where she had been held during pretrial, to serve out her remaining life. Her lawyer attempted to apply for leave to appeal both the conviction and the sentence. Judge Ndlovu dismissed the application immediately. You'd think that's where this case ends. It isn't. Because in May of 2026, just a few weeks before I'm putting this video together, Rosemary Ndlovu was convicted again in the Kempton Park Regional Court on charges of incitement to commit murder, together with a former police colleague of hers from the Norcom Park Station, a woman named Ndlovu. What it turns out happened while Rosemary was already on the run from her own crimes back in 2018 was this. Her colleague Ndlovu wanted her husband, a man named Justice Mudau, dead. She wanted to collect on his life insurance policy, which according to court testimony was worth as much as 3 million rand. Nomsa, who knew about Rosemary's reputation in certain circles, came to her for help. Rosemary did what she had always done. She connected Nomsa to one of the hitmen she had used before, a man named Jabulani Machali. The plan was for Machali to shoot Justice Mudau at the gate of his own home. The fee discussed was somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 rand. But Machali, like Kunene before him, had a moment. He didn't do the job. Instead, he went to Justice Mudau directly, told him what was being planned, told him exactly who had ordered it. Justice Mudau survived. Years later, when he testified in court, he was alive specifically because the man hired to kill him had decided not to. Think about that pattern for a second. Twice now, in the course of Rosemary Ndlovu's career as a person who hires people to kill other people, the actual hitmen turned around and saved the targets. The man who was supposed to burn 5 children alive went to the cops. The man who was supposed to shoot a husband at his own gate walked up to that husband and said, "Here is who paid me to kill you." The hitmen Rosemary kept finding were, in retrospect, more morally functional than she was. On May 20th, 2026, the Kempton Park Regional Court convicted both Rosemary Ndlovu and Nomsa Mudau of incitement to commit murder. Rosemary, who was already serving 6 life sentences plus over a century of additional time, was now looking at more years on top of that. The math, at a certain point, becomes academic, but the legal record now reflects a 7th person she tried to have killed. The case has, since the original 2021 conviction, become one of the most discussed criminal cases in modern South African history. A streaming documentary called Rosemary's Hit List, released on Showmax, walked through the murders in detail and is the project that brought the story to international true crime audiences. The case has been cited by South African insurance regulators as part of a broader push to crack down on murder for insurance syndicates, a category of crime that, according to industry experts quoted by the South African Insurance Crime Bureau, is much more common in the country than the public realizes and is enabled, just like Rosemary's 6 years of killings were enabled, by a lack of information sharing between insurance providers. Reforms are slowly happening. Whether they happen fast enough to catch the next Rosemary Ndlovu is anyone's guess. Justice Mudau is alive. Joyce Ndlovu and her 5 children are alive. And that includes a child, no longer 5 months old, who is now 8 years old, and one day will be old enough to understand why their auntie tried to do what she tried to do. Maria Mushwana, Rosemary's mother, the woman who once stood up in court to defend her, is, as of the most recent reporting, also still alive, back in Bushbuckridge. That's the surviving side of the ledger. 6 people walked out of Rosemary's life because of pure luck, or because a hitman had a conscience. 6 other people did not walk out because nothing in their world warned them what their auntie really was. For the families who lost people, the years since the verdict have been their own particular hell. Charlene Mashigo, Brilliant's grandmother, is the one raising Brilliant's son now, a boy whose mother is not in his life, whose father was murdered by his great-aunt, whose grandmother on the other side was also murdered by that same great-aunt. The boy is being raised by family because that's what's left of the family. He is one specific child in one specific village in Mpumalanga whose entire understanding of where he comes from when he's old enough to be told the truth is going to include this story. Joyce Ndlovu, the sister Rosemary tried to incinerate along with her children, gave only sparse interviews after the conviction. She told the Sunday Times that knowing what her own sister had been planning had changed something in her permanently. She said she had trouble sleeping in any house she did not personally lock down at night. She said her oldest child, now a teenager, asks questions that she does not always know how to answer. She also said, and this is the line that stuck with me, that she had no anger left, just exhaustion. The years between the arrest and the conviction had used up whatever anger she had. The Mabasa family, the relatives of Maurice, Rosemary's stabbed 80 times boyfriend, also spoke at the sentencing hearing. Maurice's sister Lucerte had come forward early in the investigation, telling the press that Rosemary had taken out multiple life insurance policies on her brother. At sentencing, his family said they wanted only one thing from Rosemary: the truth about how and where he had died. Even that she would not give them. Her position, on every count, was that she had killed nobody. The Mabasa family walked out of court with 1.3 million rand worth of insurance money paid out on their brother's body and no answers about how he had ended up with 76 knife wounds. The Tembisa police station where Rosemary had worked also had to do its own painful reckoning. Internal questions were asked about how a serving constable had been able to operate as a serial killer in plain sight of her own colleagues for 6 years. According to reporting by News 24, after her arrest, fellow officers at the station revealed that Rosemary had taken out insurance policies on multiple colleagues as well, not just family. The full scope of the 28 policies includes names that were not part of the criminal indictment. We do not know, and the public record does not tell us, who all of those other people are or what would have happened to them if she had not been arrested when she was. The South African Police Service has, in the years since, been pushed by oversight bodies to do more careful vetting of officers, particularly around personal financial pressure, gambling, and unexplained income. Whether any of those reforms are actually meaningful, or whether they exist mostly on paper, is a separate debate. The case has been studied as a textbook example in South African criminology programs of how a single serving officer was able to weaponize her own job against her own family. I want to close with the question that this case forces, even though it doesn't have a clean answer. Because the truth about Rosemary Ndlovu is, there was never a single moment where she snapped. No traumatic event that triggered her. No childhood abuse story that the press uncovered. And no mental illness diagnosis presented at trial that explained any of this. There was, instead, a woman who needed money, who discovered that murdering family members for insurance worked, who did it once, who did it twice, and who kept doing it. For 6 years, until a baby she had never met saved everyone. The criminologist who testified at her trial called her a serial killer, and the judge accepted that classification. The reason that word matters is because it tells you the killings weren't a crime of passion or a one-time bad decision. They were a pattern, a method, a job. Rosemary Ndlovu treated her own family like a portfolio. She bought policies the way other people buy stocks, and when the policies matured, when the waiting period was up, when the payouts were ready, she liquidated. That's the part that, when you finally see it, you can't unsee. If you're still watching, thank you. These cases take a lot of digging, a lot of court records, a lot of cross-checking, and I appreciate you sticking with me through this one. If something about this case stayed with you, the baby, the husband-cousin paperwork, the 80 stab wounds, the policewoman in the back of a car explaining how to burn a family alive, drop a comment with what hit you. I read all of them. One last thing before I sign off. There's a small piece of testimony from the trial that I keep coming back to. One of the witnesses, a former colleague at Tembisa Station, was asked what Rosemary had been like to work with. The colleague thought about it for a second, and then the colleague said that Rosemary had been completely normal, friendly, kind even, the kind of officer who would buy you a coffee on a rough shift. 6 funerals into her career as a serial killer, she was still the cop the others trusted at the station. The day shift saw the friendly auntie who brought lunch in for the staff. The night shift saw the chronic gambler hiding from loan sharks. The family back in Bush Buckridge saw the success story who had made it out. 6 different versions of the same woman running in parallel, none of them ever cross-checking against the others. Until the day a man with a wire in a car finally lined them up. 3 cases, 3 different countries, 3 different methods, 3 completely different kinds of damage left behind. But honestly, the thing that connects all of them isn't the badge, it's the trust. Every single victim, Susanna walking home, Angelica who'd known him since middle school, the family members who sat at dinner tables with Ndlovu, they all trusted someone who had already decided to hurt them. And I don't have a neat conclusion for that. I don't think there is one. What I will say is this: the cases that get solved almost always come down to one person who decided to speak up. A passerby who found remains in the woods. A hitman who went to the police instead. Someone who just paid attention. If you've been watching this far, drop a comment. Tell me which of these 3 cases hit hardest and why. I genuinely read them. Subscribe if you haven't. New videos every week, and I'll see you in the next one.